Hi friends. If you're enjoying my videos, please hit the like button. It helps the YouTube algorithm notice me. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. I've always been enthralled with the macabre. The darker, the better, at least as far as entertainment choices are concerned. Horror films, true crime documentaries, supernatural podcasts, I consumed them all with voracious curiosity. That being said, I had never witnessed or been part of any genuine paranormal encounter. My fascination remained safely academic, confined to the pages of books and pixels on screens. That would change dramatically in October 2023, the year I turned 27. The mountains of northern Arizona offered a welcome respite from Phoenix's lingering summer heat. My younger brother Ryan was attending a college football training camp there, and several of us had decided to make a small vacation of it. We rented a cabin in the dense pine forest, just 20 minutes from the training facilities. A perfect base camp for Ryan, and an ideal getaway for the rest of us. Our small group consisted of myself, Ryan, my older brother William, my boyfriend Jason, and Jason's childhood friend Vincent. The cabin itself was nothing remarkable. A 2-bedroom structure with a loft, rustic kitchen, and a living area centered around a stone fireplace. What made it special was its isolation. The nearest neighbor was at least half a mile away, and the forest pressed close on all sides, transforming the windows into dark mirrors after sunset. Ryan had always been the rational one in our family, level-headed, logical, rarely given to flights of fancy. Which is why his stories about experiences with a Ouija board during his freshman year had surprised me so much. He recounted them without embellishment or dramatic flair, which made them all the more unsettling. "I'm telling you," he explained one evening as we sat around the fireplace. "There were 5 of us in the dorm lounge, and that pointer moved on its own. We all swore we weren't pushing it. But you guys were probably doing that ideomotor thing," Vincent argued, gesturing with his beer bottle. "Unconscious movements. Your brain makes your muscles do things you're not aware of." Ryan shrugged. "Maybe, but it spelled out the name of our resident assistant's deceased grandmother. None of us knew that name." "Coincidence," Vincent insisted. "All I know," Ryan continued, his voice dropping slightly, "is that weird things happened in our dorm for weeks afterward. Doors opening and closing, items disappearing and reappearing in strange places. One guy even transferred to another building. The wind outside picked up, sending a hollow moan through the chimney." The sound perfectly punctuated Ryan's story, and a moment of silence fell over our group. "We should try it," I suggested suddenly. William raised an eyebrow. "Try what? A Ouija board?" "Why not?" I sat forward, genuinely excited. "We could make one. It doesn't have to be fancy." Ryan shook his head immediately. "Count me out. I've done it once, and that was enough." "Oh, come on," Jason said, nudging Ryan's shoulder. "Don't tell me you actually believe in that stuff." "I believe that there are things we don't understand," Ryan replied carefully, "and I believe in not messing with them." "I'm with Ryan on this one," William added. "Those things always gave me the creeps." But my curiosity had already taken hold. The prospect of experiencing something genuinely unexplainable thrilled me. I'd spent years immersed in horror stories. What if this was my chance to step into one? "I'm doing it," I announced, "even if I have to do it alone." I would soon regret those words more than I could possibly imagine. "You're not going to do it alone," Jason sighed, standing up from the couch. "I'll join you." Vincent, never one to miss out on anything, quickly added, "Me too. I want to prove to everyone this is nonsense." William reluctantly agreed to participate as well, though he kept glancing at Ryan, whose expression had grown increasingly concerned. "You'll need to set some rules," Ryan advised, his voice tense. "Never ask when you're going to die. Never ask about God. Never use it alone. And most importantly, you need to say goodbye properly." "What happens if we don't?" I asked, my interest piqued. Ryan's expression darkened. "You leave a door open, and things can come through." The rational part of my brain dismissed his warning as superstition, but something in his tone gave me pause. Still, my determination outweighed my caution. I began searching the cabin for materials. In the kitchen pantry, I found a large piece of cardboard, the back of a cereal variety pack. It wasn't ideal, but it would serve my purpose. I spread it out on the dining table and used a Sharpie to create a makeshift Ouija board. I drew the alphabet in a semicircle, added numbers 0 through 9 below, and wrote yes and no in the upper corners. At the bottom, I added the word goodbye. For the planchette, the pointer that supposedly moves across the board, I cut a smaller piece of cardboard into a rough heart shape. I considered how to make it slide more smoothly and ended up wrapping it in aluminum foil from the kitchen. "This is ridiculous," Vincent scoffed, watching me work. "You really think some ghosts are going to use your arts and crafts project to communicate with us?" "It's not about the materials," Ryan interjected from his position on the couch, where he was determinedly not participating. "It's about intention. The board is just a tool." I completed my creation as darkness fell outside. Rain had begun to spatter against the windows, and occasional thunder rumbled in the distance. The sudden autumn storm created the perfect atmosphere for what we were about to attempt. We gathered around the dining table, positioning the homemade board in the center. William dimmed the lights, leaving only the soft glow from the kitchen to illuminate our faces. I placed 2 candles on either side of the board and lit them, more for ambiance than necessity. "This is how it works," I explained, positioning the makeshift planchette in the center of the board. "We each put one finger lightly on the pointer, just the tip of your index finger. Don't press down, just touch it." "And then what?" Vincent asked, still looking skeptical. "We ask questions, and if there's a spirit present, it will move the pointer to answer us." "And if the pointer doesn't move?" William asked. I shrugged. "Then Vincent gets to say, 'I told you so,' and we watch a horror movie instead." Jason smiled nervously. "Let's get this over with." The 4 of us took our places around the table. Ryan remained on the couch, watching us with unconcealed apprehension. Outside, the storm intensified, rain now drumming steadily against the roof. We each placed a fingertip on the foil-covered planchette. The moment we made contact, a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the cabin, causing all of us to jump slightly. "Perfect timing," Vincent muttered. I took a deep breath. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice steady despite the flutter of anticipation in my chest. "Is there a spirit who wishes to communicate with us?" For several long moments, nothing happened. The planchette remained motionless under our fingers. Vincent shot me a knowing look, his skepticism evident. But then, almost imperceptibly at first, the planchette began to move. The movement was so subtle that I initially thought I had imagined it, a slight tremor beneath my fingertip. But then it became more pronounced, a definite sliding sensation across the cardboard. "Who's doing that?" Vincent demanded, his voice tight. "Not me," William whispered. "I'm barely touching it," Jason added. The planchette continued to move, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. It drifted toward the upper corner of the board and settled firmly on yes. A collective intake of breath circled the table. Even Vincent appeared startled. "Is anyone there?" I repeated, my heart now pounding against my ribs. Again, the planchette moved to yes. "Who are you?" I asked. The planchette began to move more deliberately now, hovering over letters in sequence, spelling out visitor. "Visitor?" William echoed. "Visitor from where?" The planchette circled the board once before spelling out far. "That's conveniently vague," Vincent muttered, though his earlier smugness had faded considerably. "Are you a good spirit?" Jason asked. The planchette remained motionless for what felt like an uncomfortably long time. Then, slowly, it moved to yes. "They all say that," Ryan called from the couch. His voice startled me. I'd almost forgotten he was there. "Do you have a message for any of us?" I asked, ignoring my brother's comment. The planchette spelled watch. "Watch what?" William asked, tension evident in his voice. "Darkness," came the reply. As if responding to these words, the lights in the cabin flickered briefly. The storm outside had intensified, wind now howling around the eaves. "I don't like this," William said quietly. "It's just the storm affecting the power," I reassured him, though I felt a distinct uneasiness spreading through my body. "Let's ask something specific, something that would prove this is real." Vincent, still the most skeptical despite his obvious discomfort, nodded. "Good idea. Let me ask something only I would know." He cleared his throat. "What was the name of my childhood dog when I was 5 years old?" The planchette began to move immediately, with purpose and precision, spelling Scout. Vincent's face drained of color. "How did—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "That's correct. I've never mentioned Scout to any of you. Lucky guess, William suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. The heavy feeling in the room intensified. The candle flame suddenly bent sideways, though there was no draft I could detect. Ask something else, I urged, a mixture of fear and excitement coursing through me. What's our brother's name, the one who isn't here? I asked, testing the entity. William, the planchette spelled. No, William is here, I corrected. Our other brother. Ryan, it responded. I glanced at Ryan, who was now standing behind the couch, watching us intently. That was an easy one, I acknowledged. What's the name of William's fiancée? The planchette hesitated, then began to move, spelling Rebecca. Close, William said, his voice strained. It's Rebecca, with 2 C's. As if hearing the correction, the planchette moved to no and then spelled Rebecca. A chill crept across my skin. The precision was unsettling. I want to stop, William suddenly announced, but he didn't remove his finger from the planchette. Just a few more questions, I pleaded, completely captivated by what was happening. The planchette suddenly jerked violently, nearly jumping off the board entirely. When it settled, it began to move again, faster than before, spelling danger. What danger? Jason asked, his voice barely audible. Opening, came the reply. What's opening? I demanded. Door, was the simple answer. At that precise moment, a tremendous gust of wind hit the cabin, and the front door flew open, slamming against the wall with a crash that made all of us jump. Cold air and rain swept into the room, extinguishing both candles simultaneously. Vincent jerked his hand away from the planchette. That's it, I'm done. In the confusion that followed, William rushing to close the door, Jason fumbling for the light switch, I lost track of the planchette. When the lights came back on, I noticed with alarm that it was still moving across the board despite no one touching it. It came to rest on a single word. No. Nobody move, Ryan said, suddenly beside the table. His face was ashen. You need to finish this properly. What's happening? William demanded, water dripping from his hair where the rain had caught him. You've made contact with something, Ryan explained, his voice tight with tension. And it doesn't want you to end the session. Vincent gave a nervous laugh. This is ridiculous. The wind blew the door open. The pointer moved because the table got bumped. Then why is it still moving? I whispered. All eyes turned to the planchette, which was indeed sliding in small circular movements across the center of the board, without any human contact. Everyone sit back down, Ryan instructed. All 4 of you need to put your fingers back on the planchette and properly close the session. I'm not touching that thing again, Vincent protested. You have to, Ryan insisted. You helped open this door. You need to help close it. Outside, the storm had reached a fevered pitch. Rain lashed against the windows like gravel, and the wind moaned through the trees with an almost human quality. The electric lights flickered again, longer this time, threatening to plunge us into darkness. Reluctantly, we resumed our positions around the table. I could feel the tension radiating from each person as we placed our fingertips back on the planchette. The moment we made contact, it began to move with purpose, spelling, not alone. What does that mean? Jason whispered. Brought others, the planchette continued. A distinct thud came from upstairs, something heavy falling. William jerked his head toward the sound. There's nobody up there, he said. Ask who these others are, Ryan urged from behind me. Who came with you? I asked, my mouth dry with fear. Hungry ones, the planchette spelled. The temperature in the room seemed to drop precipitously. My breath fogged in front of my face. I think we should say goodbye now, William suggested, his voice shaking slightly. Before anyone could respond, the planchette shot across the board to spell, never leave. We need to end this, Ryan insisted. All of you, move the pointer to goodbye and say it out loud together. We attempted to guide the planchette toward the word at the bottom of the board, but it resisted, as if being pulled in the opposite direction. The sensation was undeniable. Something was fighting against our collective effort. Push harder, Ryan commanded. With considerable effort, we managed to drag the planchette to goodbye. Now say it, Ryan instructed. All together. Goodbye, we chorused, our voices uneven. Nothing happened for a moment. The planchette remained motionless under our fingers. Then, without warning, it flew off the board entirely, skittering across the table and onto the floor. The candles, which William had relit, extinguished themselves simultaneously. For several seconds, no one moved or spoke. The only sound was the storm outside and our rapid breathing. "Is it over?" Jason finally asked. "I don't know," Ryan admitted. "I've never seen it respond like that." As if hearing the correction, the planchette moved to no and then spelled Rebecca. A chill crept across my skin. The precision was unsettling. "I want to stop," William suddenly announced, but he didn't remove his finger from the planchette. "Just a few more questions," I pleaded, completely captivated by what was happening. The planchette suddenly jerked violently, nearly jumping off the board entirely. When it settled, it began to move again, faster than before, spelling danger. "What danger?" Jason asked, his voice barely audible. "Opening," came the reply. "What's opening?" I demanded. "Door," was the simple answer. At that precise moment, a tremendous gust of wind hit the cabin, and the front door flew open, slamming against the wall with a crash that made all of us jump. Cold air and rain swept into the room, extinguishing both candles simultaneously. Vincent jerked his hand away from the planchette. "That's it, I'm done." In the confusion that followed, William rushing to close the door, Jason fumbling for the light switch, I lost track of the planchette. When the lights came back on, I noticed with alarm that it was still moving across the board despite no one touching it. It came to rest on a single word. "No." "Nobody move," Ryan said, suddenly beside the table. His face was ashen. "You need to finish this properly." "What's happening?" William demanded, water dripping from his hair where the rain had caught him. "You've made contact with something," Ryan explained, his voice tight with tension. "And it doesn't want you to end the session." Vincent gave a nervous laugh. "This is ridiculous. The wind blew the door open. The pointer moved because the table got bumped." "Then why is it still moving?" I whispered. All eyes turned to the planchette, which was indeed sliding in small circular movements across the center of the board, without any human contact. "Everyone sit back down," Ryan instructed. "All four of you need to put your fingers back on the planchette and properly close the session." "I'm not touching that thing again," Vincent protested. "You have to," Ryan insisted. "You helped open this door. You need to help close it." Outside, the storm had reached a fevered pitch. Rain lashed against the windows like gravel, and the wind moaned through the trees with an almost human quality. The electric lights flickered again, longer this time, threatening to plunge us into darkness. Reluctantly, we resumed our positions around the table. I could feel the tension radiating from each person as we placed our fingertips back on the planchette. The moment we made contact, it began to move with purpose, spelling, "not alone." "What does that mean?" Jason whispered. "Brought others," the planchette continued. A distinct thud came from upstairs, something heavy falling. William jerked his head toward the sound. "There's nobody up there," he said. "Ask who these others are," Ryan urged from behind me. "Who came with you?" I asked, my mouth dry with fear. "Hungry ones," the planchette spelled. The temperature in the room seemed to drop precipitously. My breath fogged in front of my face. "I think we should say goodbye now," William suggested, his voice shaking slightly. Before anyone could respond, the planchette shot across the board to spell, "Never leave." "We need to end this," Ryan insisted. "All of you, move the pointer to goodbye and say it out loud together." We attempted to guide the planchette toward the word at the bottom of the board, but it resisted, as if being pulled in the opposite direction. The sensation was undeniable. Something was fighting against our collective effort. "Push harder," Ryan commanded. With considerable effort, we managed to drag the planchette to goodbye. "Now say it," Ryan instructed. "All together." "Goodbye," we chorused, our voices uneven. Nothing happened for a moment. The planchette remained motionless under our fingers. Then, without warning, it flew off the board entirely, skittering across the table and onto the floor. The candles, which William had relit, extinguished themselves simultaneously. For several seconds, no one moved or spoke. The only sound was the storm outside and our rapid breathing. "Is it over?" Jason finally asked. "I don't know," Ryan admitted. "I've never seen it respond like that." Vincent stood abruptly. "This whole thing is nonsense. You all convinced yourselves something supernatural was happening, but it was just the power of suggestion and a convenient storm." Then how do you explain it knowing about Scout? William challenged. One of you must have heard me mention him before. Or maybe it was just coincidence, Vincent replied, but his confident tone had a forced quality to it. I remained seated, staring at the makeshift board. Something felt unfinished, incomplete, as if a conversation had been interrupted rather than concluded. We should burn the board, Ryan suggested, just to be safe. Now you're being ridiculous, Vincent scoffed. It's a piece of cardboard with marker on it. I don't care, Ryan insisted. I've seen what happens when these things aren't handled properly. In the end, we compromised. I folded the board and the planchette and sealed them in a plastic bag, which Ryan then stored in the trunk of his car. The physical objects were removed from the cabin, but as I would soon discover, whatever we had contacted wasn't so easily dismissed. Sleep eluded me that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the planchette moving across my homemade board, spelling out warnings. The storm eventually passed, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. The silence seemed almost worse than the howling wind, expectant, as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting. I shared a room with Jason, while William and Vincent took the second bedroom, and Ryan claimed the loft. Around 2 a.m., I finally drifted into a restless sleep, only to be jarred awake by a sound I couldn't immediately identify. Tap, tap, tap. My eyes flew open, staring into darkness. Beside me, Jason slept soundly, his breathing deep and regular. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window, a precise, deliberate rhythm. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. I told myself it was just a branch, though I couldn't recall any trees growing close enough to touch the cabin. Pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders, I tried to ignore it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound continued, growing slightly louder. With each sequence, my anxiety increased. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, I slipped out of bed and approached the window. The curtains were drawn, and I hesitated before reaching out to pull them aside. The tapping stopped the moment my fingers touched the fabric, as if whatever was causing it knew I was there. I yanked the curtains open, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. Instead, I was met with the empty darkness of the forest. No branches, no birds, nothing that could have caused the sound. As I stared into the night, my eyes adjusted to reveal the moonlit outlines of trees, and between them, a movement, something shifting in the shadows, just at the edge of perception. Not animal, not human, but something deliberately concealing itself. I let the curtain fall back into place and retreated to the bed, my heart hammering. For the remainder of the night, I lay awake, listening. The tapping didn't resume, but something worse took its place, the distinct sensation of being watched. Morning came with a welcome brightness that seemed to banish the night's anxieties. Over breakfast, I mentioned the tapping, but no one else had heard anything unusual. Probably just the house settling after the storm, William suggested, pouring himself coffee. Or pine cones hitting the roof, Jason offered. They fall all the time up here. Only Ryan looked concerned. Did anything else happen? He asked quietly while the others were distracted. I thought I saw something moving in the trees, I admitted, but it was dark and my imagination was probably running wild. Ryan nodded slowly. Keep an eye out, and maybe we should all stay together today. The day passed uneventfully. Ryan had football training, and the rest of us hiked a nearby trail, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the spectacular fall colors. The forest seemed completely benign in daylight, a stark contrast to the menacing presence I had sensed the previous night. By evening, even I had nearly convinced myself that my experience had been nothing more than nerves and an overactive imagination influenced by our Ouija session. We returned to the cabin for dinner, and as darkness fell, Vincent suggested we watch a horror movie, an ironic choice that nonetheless helped lighten the mood. By midnight, we were all ready for bed, the previous night's uneasiness seemingly forgotten. I fell asleep quickly this time, exhausted from the hike and the previous night's insomnia. But my rest was short-lived. I jolted awake, disoriented. The room was pitch black, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then the details rushed back. The cabin, the Ouija board, the tapping at the window. What had awakened me? I strained my ears, listening. The cabin was silent except for Jason's breathing beside me. Then I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. It seemed to be coming from the ceiling. I lay frozen, tracking the sound as it moved directly overhead, then across the ceiling to the far wall, down the wall, and finally to the bedroom door. The doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. I tried to call out to Jason, but my voice lodged in my throat. The door began to open, a sliver of deeper darkness appearing in the gap. With tremendous effort, I managed to reach out and shake Jason awake. "Someone's in the house," I whispered urgently. Jason sat up immediately, instantly alert. "What? Where?" The door stopped moving. "The door. It was opening by itself," I said, my voice trembling. Jason reached for his phone, activating the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the door, which was firmly closed. "Are you sure?" he asked, scanning the room. "It looks closed to me." "I swear it was opening, and there was a scratching sound on the ceiling," I insisted. Jason got out of bed and checked the door, then the closet, then under the bed. "There's no one here," he assured me. "You were probably dreaming." But I knew I hadn't been dreaming. The scratching had been too distinct, the movement of the doorknob too real. "I'm going to check the rest of the cabin," Jason said, pulling on a t-shirt. I followed him, unwilling to be left alone. We checked every room, finding William and Vincent sound asleep in their room and Ryan dozing in the loft. Everything seemed normal. "See? Everyone's asleep. There's no one here but us," Jason said gently. We returned to our room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As Jason drifted back to sleep, I remained awake, watching the door. Just as dawn began to lighten the sky, I heard it again, the faint scratching sound, this time from inside the closet. Before I could react, the closet door swung open a few inches, though there was no draft to explain the movement. I closed my eyes tightly, telling myself it wasn't real. When I opened them again, the door was closed, but the scratching continued. The next morning, tension hung in the cabin like a fog. No one seemed well rested. Vincent appeared particularly haggard, with dark circles under his eyes. "Bad night?" I asked him as he fumbled with the coffee maker. He glanced at me, then quickly away. "Just couldn't sleep, kept hearing weird noises." My stomach tightened. "What kind of noises?" Vincent hesitated. "Like whispering, right outside the bedroom door. I thought it was one of you guys at first, but when I checked, there was no one there." William, emerging from the bathroom, overheard our conversation. "You heard it too? I thought I was losing my mind." "What did you hear?" I asked, my uneasiness growing. "Same thing. Whispering, and footsteps in the hall, but every time I looked, there was nothing." Jason joined us, looking perplexed. "So everyone had a bad night? I thought it was just you," he said, nodding to me. Ryan was the last to come downstairs, his expression grim. "We need to talk about what's happening," he announced without preamble. "Nothing's happening," Vincent insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Old cabins make noises. We're all just on edge because of that stupid board game." "It wasn't a game," Ryan said quietly, "and you know it." The five of us gathered around the dining table, the same table where we'd used the Ouija board. In daylight, with cups of coffee and the smell of toast in the air, it seemed absurd to be discussing supernatural phenomena, and yet the shared experiences of the night were difficult to dismiss. "Here's what I think," Ryan began. "When we used the board, we made contact with something that probably shouldn't have been contacted, and because we didn't end the session properly, it's still here." "That's ridiculous," Vincent interjected, but with less certainty than before. "Is it?" Ryan challenged. "You all heard things last night, things that can't be easily explained." "So, what do we do?" William asked. "Exorcism? Sage burning? Call a priest?" Ryan shook his head. "I'm not sure. In my experience, these things usually fade over time if you don't engage with them. But this feels different, more intentional." "We could try using the board again," I suggested. "Properly say goodbye this time." "Absolutely not," Ryan said firmly. "That would only make things worse, give it more of a connection to us." "Then we leave," Vincent decided. "Pack up and get out today." No one argued with this suggestion. Within an hour, we were gathering our belongings, eager to cut our stay short by 2 days. As I was packing my suitcase, I noticed something strange. A small symbol drawn in what looked like ash on the inside of the closet door. It resembled an eye within a triangle. I hadn't seen it before, and I was certain it hadn't been there the previous day. I called Ryan to my room and showed him the marking. "Did you do this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Ryan shook his head slowly, his expression darkening. "We need to leave. Now." We hastened our packing, an unspoken urgency driving us, but as we were loading the cars, a peculiar lethargy began to settle over me. My limbs felt heavy, my thoughts foggy. Looking at the others, I could see they were experiencing similar effects, movements becoming sluggish, eyes struggling to stay focused. "Does anyone else feel strange?" William asked, leaning against his car. Everyone nodded, too drained to speak. "It doesn't want us to leave," Ryan said, his voice tight with effort. "We need to fight this." With tremendous concentration, we managed to finish loading the vehicles. I climbed into Jason's car, while Vincent and William took William's car. Ryan had his own. As Jason turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine didn't even attempt to turn over. "Battery's dead," he announced, trying again. In the car next to us, William was having the same issue. Only Ryan's car started successfully. "This can't be a coincidence," I said, fear clutching at my chest. Ryan approached our car. "Both batteries dead at the same time? No way." "We'll jump them," Vincent suggested. But even with jumper cables connected to Ryan's running car, neither vehicle would start. "This is impossible," Jason muttered, checking under the hood for any obvious problems. "We'll have to call for help," William decided, pulling out his phone. His expression immediately fell. No signal. We all checked our phones. Not one had service, despite having had perfect reception the previous days. "We'll take my car," Ryan offered. "We can all squeeze in, leave the luggage." We abandoned the dead vehicles and piled into Ryan's small sedan. As he put it in reverse, the engine suddenly died. "No," Ryan whispered, trying the ignition again. The car remained silent. We were stranded. By mid-afternoon, we had exhausted all practical options. A hike to the nearest town would take at least 4 hours, and with darkness approaching and no guarantee of finding help, it seemed more prudent to remain at the cabin for one more night. "We'll try again in the morning," William reasoned. "Maybe whatever electrical issue affected the cars will resolve itself." No one mentioned the impossibility of 3 separate vehicles experiencing simultaneous electrical failures, or the coincidence of all our phones losing service at once. The unspoken understanding was that something beyond our control, something potentially malevolent, had trapped us here. We unloaded the essential items from the cars and returned to the cabin. The atmosphere inside had changed noticeably. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper. Even with all the lights on, the room seemed dimmer than before. "We should stay together tonight," Ryan suggested as evening approached. "All of us in the living room." No one objected. The thought of separating, of facing the night alone in our respective rooms, was unbearable. We arranged the couch cushions and spare blankets on the living room floor, creating a makeshift communal sleeping area. The television provided background noise, a cooking show that none of us actually watched, but which filled the silence with comforting, ordinary sounds. As night fell, our conversation grew increasingly strained. We avoided discussing the strange occurrences directly, instead making forced small talk about work, sports, future plans, anything to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Around 10 p.m., the lights flickered, then went out completely. The television died mid-sentence, plunging us into darkness and silence. "Power outage," Jason said quickly, his voice unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Vincent used his phone's flashlight to locate candles in the kitchen. Soon, the living room was illuminated by a half-dozen small flames, casting elongated shadows across the walls. "Everyone try to get some sleep," William suggested. "Tomorrow we'll hike out at first light." We settled into our makeshift beds, but sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind outside, sent waves of anxiety through me. The first incident occurred around midnight. A series of loud knocks, 3 in succession, thundered through the cabin. They didn't come from the doors or windows, but seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if something massive were trying to enter. We all sat upright, exchanging alarmed glances. "What was that?" Vincent whispered. Before anyone could respond, the knocking repeated. 3 heavy thuds that vibrated through the floor. "It's just the structure settling," Jason attempted, but his voice trembled. The knocking continued, moving around the cabin in a circular pattern. 3 knocks on the east wall, 3 on the north, 3 on the west, 3 on the south. A complete circuit. Then silence fell again, more oppressive than before. "I'm going to check outside," William announced, reaching for his phone. "Don't," Ryan warned. "That's what it wants, to separate us." "There's nothing out there," Vincent insisted, though he made no move to verify his claim. The second incident happened about an hour later. The temperature in the cabin plummeted suddenly, our breath forming visible clouds in the candlelight. The cold was unnatural, bone-deep and penetrating, impossible for an autumn night. "Something's here," Ryan whispered, his eyes scanning the shadows beyond our candle-lit circle. A sound began to emerge from the darkness, a low, rhythmic scraping, like nails dragging across wood. It started faint but grew steadily louder, circling our position just as the knocking had done. In the flickering light, I noticed something on the wall, a dark stain spreading slowly across the wooden paneling. As I watched in horror, it formed into a crude symbol, the same eye within a triangle I had found in the closet. "Look!" I gasped, pointing. All eyes turned to the wall. As we watched, more symbols began to appear, forming a circle around the room, just above eye level. "What are they?" Jason asked, his voice barely audible. "Nothing good," Ryan responded grimly. The scraping sound intensified, now accompanied by a low, atonal humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The candle flames bent sideways, all pointing toward the center of our circle, defying the laws of physics. Vincent suddenly clutched at his chest, his eyes wide with panic. "I can't breathe," he gasped, struggling for air. William moved to help him, but froze halfway. "Something's touching me," he choked out, visibly trembling. The humming grew louder, resolving into something that almost resembled words. Indecipherable but clearly intentional communication. "Don't listen to it," Ryan commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. "Cover your ears and close your eyes, all of you." We obeyed, huddling closer together. Through my closed eyelids, I could sense the candles growing brighter, their light intensifying to an impossible degree. The air pressurized, as if we were deep underwater or at high altitude. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The pressure released, the temperature normalized, and the humming ceased. I cautiously opened my eyes. The candles burned normally again, and the shadows had retreated to their corners. The symbols on the wall had vanished, leaving no trace. "Is it over?" Jason whispered. Ryan shook his head slowly. "No, it's just beginning." The remainder of the night passed in tense vigilance. None of us slept. By dawn, we were exhausted, strung out, and desperate to escape. The morning light revealed something none of us had expected. All 3 cars were now parked differently than we had left them, arranged in a perfect triangle around the cabin. We didn't discuss the repositioned vehicles. Some things are too inexplicable, too terrifying to acknowledge directly. Instead, we focused on what seemed manageable, checking if any of the cars would start. Miraculously, all 3 roared to life without issue. "Let's go, now," Vincent urged, already throwing his belongings into William's car. No one argued. Within 15 minutes, we had packed and were ready to depart. As I performed a final sweep of the bedroom to ensure I hadn't forgotten anything, I noticed something on the mirror, condensation forming letters before my eyes. "Always watching." I backed out of the room without a word and hurried to the car. The drive down the mountain was tense but uneventful. Cell service returned about 20 minutes into our journey, and the feeling of oppression that had hung over us began to lift slightly. "Did that really happen?" Jason asked as we neared the interstate. "All of it?" "I don't know what it was," I replied honestly, but something happened. We parted ways at a gas station near Flagstaff, Ryan heading back to his training camp, William and Vincent returning to their shared apartment, Jason and I to our place in Phoenix. The normalcy of the gas station, people fueling cars, buying snacks, going about their ordinary lives, seemed surreal after what we had experienced. I hugged Ryan goodbye, holding on perhaps longer than necessary. "Be careful," he warned quietly. "These things don't always end when you leave the place." His words sent a chill through me, but I nodded and forced a smile. "I will." The drive home to Phoenix was silent, both Jason and I lost in our own thoughts. The familiar desert landscape was a welcome change from the dense, secretive forest, and by the time we reached our apartment, I had almost convinced myself that we could put the experience behind us. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in days, exhaustion finally overcoming anxiety. But my relief was short-lived. I began to notice small discrepancies in our apartment. Objects moved from where I'd left them, doors I was certain I'd closed standing open, electronics turning on by themselves. Jason experienced similar phenomena, but attributed them to forgetfulness or mechanical glitches. A week after our return, I received a frantic call from William. "It followed us," he said without preamble. "Vincent and I, we're seeing things, hearing things. It's here." "What kind of things?" I asked, though I already knew. "Shadows moving when nothing's there, whispering at night, and the symbols. They're appearing on our walls." My stomach dropped. "Have you told Ryan?" "He's not answering his phone. His roommate says he hasn't shown up for practice in 3 days." The implications of this hit me with physical force. We need to find him. Within hours, Jason and I were back on the road to Flagstaff. When we reached Ryan's dormitory, his roommate confirmed our fears. No one had seen Ryan since his return from the cabin. He was acting weird, the roommate told us. Jumpy, kept saying something was watching him. We filed a missing persons report with campus security and the local police, but I knew in my heart that conventional methods wouldn't help. Whatever had happened to Ryan was beyond ordinary explanation. That evening, gathered in a hotel room with William and Vincent, I finally voiced what we had all been avoiding. We opened something with that board, something that attached itself to us, and now we need to figure out how to close it. "If Ryan couldn't figure it out, what chance do we have?" Vincent asked, his former skepticism entirely gone. "We have to try," I insisted, "for Ryan's sake and for our own." Over the following days, we researched obsessively, consulting books on the paranormal, speaking with self-proclaimed experts, even visiting a local church to speak with a priest. The consistent advice was troubling. We needed to confront whatever entity we had contacted and formally break its connection to us. "You mean use the board again?" William realized, horror evident in his voice. "It's the only way," I confirmed. "We opened a door. Now we have to close it properly." None of us wanted to return to the cabin, so we decided to conduct the ritual in William and Vincent's apartment. I recreated the Ouija board, more carefully this time, with research into the proper symbols and configurations. We gathered the necessary protective elements suggested by our sources: salt, blessed candles, religious symbols. On the night of the full moon, exactly 2 weeks after our initial contact, we sat around the board. The atmosphere was solemn, purposeful, no longer a game or an experiment, but a desperate attempt to undo what we had done. "Remember," I instructed, "no matter what happens, we must end by moving to goodbye and breaking contact, all of us together." We placed our fingers on the planchette. The candles flickered simultaneously, though there was no draft. "We wish to speak with the entity we contacted at the cabin," I stated firmly. The planchette remained still for several long moments. Then slowly, it began to move, spelling "here." "We want to formally close our connection with you," William said, his voice steady despite his obvious fear. The planchette circled the board twice before spelling "not done." "What do you want from us?" Vincent asked. "One of you," came the reply. A chill pervaded the room. The implication was clear. "Where is our brother Ryan?" I demanded. "Mine now," the planchette spelled. Jason gripped my hand tightly with his free one. "We need to end this." "Not without knowing what happened to Ryan," I insisted. The planchette moved again. "Trade." "Trade what?" William asked. "1 for 1, was the answer. Understanding dawned with horrifying clarity. It wanted one of us in exchange for Ryan. "No deals," I stated firmly. "We're closing this connection now. You have no power here." The planchette jerked violently, nearly pulling out of our grasp, spelling "always power." The lights in the apartment flickered, then went out. In the sudden darkness, illuminated only by our candles, the planchette continued to move, spelling out the same phrase repeatedly. "Always watching." "Now," I commanded. "To goodbye. Push it there together." With collective effort, we forced the planchette to the word at the bottom of the board. "Goodbye!" we shouted in unison. The candles extinguished simultaneously. For a moment, absolute darkness enveloped us. Then a single blinding flash of light illuminated the room. and in that instant, I saw a figure standing in the corner. Not Ryan, not anyone I recognized, but something wearing the approximation of a human form, its features obscured by shadow despite the intense light. When the lights came back on moments later, we were alone in the apartment. The Ouija board was completely blank, all my careful lettering and symbols erased as if they had never existed. We never found Ryan. The official investigation concluded that he had left campus voluntarily, possibly experiencing a mental health crisis. His car was discovered abandoned at a hiking trailhead 50 miles from the cabin with no sign of foul play. But we knew the truth, or at least part of it. Something had taken him. Something we had inadvertently invited into our lives through a simple act of curiosity. In the months that followed, the strange occurrences gradually subsided. The moving objects, the unexplained sounds, the feeling of being watched, all slowly faded. But they never disappeared completely. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake to the sound of 3 deliberate knocks or catch glimpses of symbols forming momentarily on my bathroom mirror after a shower. And occasionally, when I'm alone at night, I hear whispering, too faint to understand, but persistent. Waiting. Watching. I've learned to live with it, this persistent echo of our mistake. But I've never used a Ouija board again, nor will I ever. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed, and some prices are too high for mere curiosity. The summer of 2019 was particularly hot in Kentucky. I had just turned 16 and was eager to escape the confines of our small-town home, where the air conditioning struggled against the relentless heat. My 12-year-old brother Michael had been begging for weeks to go hiking in the Daniel Boone National Forest. Our parents finally relented, agreeing to take us for a day trip before school resumed in August. That morning, I woke with a strange sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. The weather forecast predicted clear skies, but dark clouds had gathered on the horizon as we loaded our backpacks into the car. My father noticed my hesitation. "Something wrong?" he asked, keys dangling from his fingertips. "No," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." The 2-hour drive to the forest entrance passed in relative silence. Michael dozed against the window, his breath fogging the glass in rhythmic patterns. Our parents discussed mundane topics in hushed tones from the front seats. I stared out at the passing landscape, watching as suburban neighborhoods gradually gave way to rolling hills and dense woodland. We arrived at the visitor center around noon. The parking lot was surprisingly empty for a Saturday in July. Only 3 other vehicles occupied spaces near the trailhead. My father consulted a map with a park ranger while my mother applied sunscreen to Michael's already freckled face. "We'll meet you kids back here at 5, my father said, handing me a trail map. "Stay on the marked paths and don't go beyond the creek bridge. Your mother and I are going to check out the historical sites near the eastern entrance." I nodded, slipping the folded map into my back pocket. "We'll be fine." Michael bounced with excitement beside me, his sneakers kicking up small puffs of dust from the dry ground. "Can we go now? Can we?" "Remember," my mother added, adjusting the straps of my backpack, "you have the emergency whistle and your phone, though reception might be spotty. Be careful." With final instructions to stay hydrated and watch out for poison ivy, our parents left us at the trailhead, their car disappearing down the winding road toward the eastern section of the park. Michael tugged at my sleeve. "Race you to the first marker." Before I could respond, he had already darted into the woods, his laughter trailing behind him like a breadcrumb path I had no choice but to follow. The first hour of our hike passed pleasantly enough. The main trail was well maintained and clearly marked with blue blazes on trees every 100 feet or so. Dappled sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting shifting patterns across the forest floor. Birds called to one another, creating a natural symphony that masked our footsteps on the soft earth. Michael moved with boundless energy, stopping occasionally to examine interesting rocks or snap pictures of unusual plants with the disposable camera our mother had given him. I maintained a more measured pace, keeping my brother within sight while scanning our surroundings. "Look at this beetle," Michael exclaimed, crouching to observe an iridescent insect making its laborious journey across a fallen log. "It's like it's wearing armor." I knelt beside him, watching as the beetle's carapace caught the light. It's a buprestid, a jewel beetle. They're uncommon around here. How do you know that? Biology class, I replied, straightening up. We should keep moving if we want to reach the creek before it gets too late. As we continued along the trail, I began to notice subtle changes in the forest atmosphere. The bird songs grew less frequent, replaced by an unsettling stillness that seemed to press against my eardrums. The trees grew denser, their branches creating a thicker canopy that dimmed the afternoon light to an early twilight gloom. A twig snapped somewhere to our left. Michael didn't seem to notice, but I paused, turning toward the sound. Nothing moved in the underbrush. After a moment, I dismissed it as a squirrel, or perhaps a rabbit disturbed by our presence. How much farther? Michael asked, his earlier enthusiasm beginning to wane as fatigue set in. I consulted the map. About another mile to the creek bridge. Want to rest for a bit? He shook his head stubbornly. I'm not tired. We pressed on, but I couldn't shake the growing sensation of being watched. Twice more I heard sounds from the forest around us, a rustling in bushes, a soft thud like a cautious footfall. Each time I stopped to listen, the noise ceased immediately, leaving only the sound of our breathing and Michael's constant chatter. Do you feel that? I asked abruptly, cutting off my brother's monologue about his video game achievements. Feel what? Like something's following us. Michael looked around, his expression shifting from annoyance to uncertainty. No, but now you're freaking me out. Sorry, I muttered, forcing a smile. Just my imagination. But it wasn't imagination when, moments later, we both heard a low growl emanating from somewhere in the dense undergrowth to our right. Michael froze, his hand instinctively reaching for mine. What was that? He whispered, eyes wide. Probably just a dog from another hiking group, I suggested, though I knew it wasn't true. The sound had a wild quality to it, something primal and undomesticated. I quickened our pace, keeping Michael close as we navigated a section of trail that descended sharply toward what I hoped was the creek basin. The map indicated we were approaching our destination, and I felt an irrational urgency to reach the open space by the water. Behind us, branches cracked as something moved parallel to our path, just out of sight among the trees. We reached the creek crossing around 4 o'clock. The bridge was less impressive than I had imagined, a simple wooden structure spanning a shallow stream that gurgled over smooth stones. Still, the open area provided relief from the claustrophobic feeling of the forest trail. Michael immediately perked up at the sight of water. Can I collect some rocks from the creek? Sure, I said, dropping my backpack on a flat boulder near the bridge. But stay where I can see you. While my brother scampered down to the water's edge, I took the opportunity to survey our surroundings. The creek cut a narrow swath through the forest, creating a natural corridor that extended in both directions as far as I could see. The opposite bank rose more steeply than our side, covered in dense bushes and younger trees that seemed to crowd the water's edge. The sunlight was taking on the golden quality of late afternoon, casting long shadows across the water. According to my watch, we had about an hour before we needed to head back to meet our parents. I sat on the boulder, stretching my legs and sipping water from my bottle, watching as Michael waded ankle-deep into the creek, searching for interesting stones. Don't go too far, I called when he ventured toward the middle of the stream. I'm not, he called back, bending to retrieve a particularly smooth pebble. This one looks like an egg. I smiled, feeling my earlier tension begin to dissolve. The forest sounds seemed normal again. The bubbling of the creek, insects buzzing, distant bird calls. Whatever had followed us on the trail appeared to have lost interest or taken another path. Michael spent the next 30 minutes collecting rocks and skipping the flatter ones across the water's surface. His throws rarely made it to the opposite bank, faltering and sinking midstream. I bet I can throw all the way across, he declared, selecting a palm-sized stone from his collection. We should probably start heading back soon, I said, checking my watch again. It's getting late. Just one more try, he insisted. Watch this. He drew his arm back and flung the stone with all his might. To both our surprise, it sailed across the creek and landed with a solid thud among the bushes on the far side. Did you see that? He shouted, jumping excitedly. I did it! I was about to congratulate him when something caught my eye, a brief flash of reflection from the undergrowth where his stone had landed. At first, I thought it might be water droplets catching the sunlight, but then I saw it again. a distinct pair of eyes gleaming in the shadow of the bushes. "Michael," I said quietly, standing up from the boulder. "Come here. Right now." Something in my voice must have conveyed the urgency I felt, because for once, he didn't argue. He splashed out of the creek and moved to my side, water dripping from his sneakers. "What's wrong?" he asked, following my gaze across the water. "Do you see that? In the bushes where your rock landed?" He squinted, then gasped. "Eyes. Is it watching us?" Before I could answer, another pair of eyes appeared several feet away from the first, the same eerie yellowish gleam reflecting the diminishing sunlight. A cold sensation settled in my stomach as I realized what we were seeing. "We need to go," I said, grabbing my backpack and slinging it over my shoulder. "Now?" "But what are they?" Michael persisted, still staring at the growing number of reflective eyes emerging from the underbrush. There were at least 4 pairs now, unblinking and fixed on our position. "Coyotes," I whispered, recognizing the distinctive eye shine. "A pack of them." As if responding to my identification, one of the animals moved forward, partially emerging from the bushes. Its lean frame and pointed ears were unmistakable even in the fading light. The coyote stood at the water's edge, assessing us with calculated interest that sent waves of primal fear through my body. I had read about coyotes before, normally shy creatures that avoided human contact. But something about this group's behavior felt wrong. They weren't retreating as wild animals typically would in the presence of humans. Instead, they seemed to be strategically positioning themselves along the bank. "They won't cross the water, right?" Michael asked, his voice barely audible. As if in direct challenge to his question, the lead coyote placed one paw into the creek, testing the current. The water was shallow enough that crossing would present no significant obstacle. I grasped Michael's shoulder, slowly backing us away from the creek's edge toward the trail we had come from. "Don't run yet," I instructed, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "We're going to walk backward until we reach the trail, then we'll turn and move quickly. Understand?" He nodded, his face pale with fear. We retreated step by step, watching as more coyotes revealed themselves along the opposite bank. I counted 7 distinct animals now, their collective gaze tracking our movement with predatory intensity. The lead coyote had moved deeper into the creek, water now reaching its chest as it tested the crossing. We had almost reached the trailhead when Michael's foot caught on an exposed root. He stumbled, catching himself before falling but dislodging a shower of small stones that clattered down toward the creek. The sound seemed to trigger something in the pack. The lead coyote suddenly lunged forward, splashing across the remaining width of the creek with surprising speed. The others followed, transforming from stationary watchers to a coordinated hunting party in seconds. "Run!" I shouted, pushing Michael ahead of me onto the trail. "Go!" We bolted into the forest, the path now shadowed by the setting sun. I could hear the splash of water behind us as the coyote pack crossed the creek, followed by the soft thud of paws on earth. My mind raced through everything I knew about coyotes, typically cautious around humans, predominantly nocturnal, normally hunting smaller prey like rabbits and rodents. This behavior was aberrant, suggesting either extreme hunger or possibly disease. Michael ran ahead of me, his shorter legs pumping furiously. I kept close behind him, constantly glancing over my shoulder to gauge the distance between us and our pursuers. The coyotes had spread out across the width of the trail, running with the efficient gait of experienced predators. "Keep going," I urged as Michael began to slow. "Don't stop." "I can't," he gasped, his breath coming in ragged pants. "Too fast." The trail inclined sharply upward, forcing us to scramble rather than run. My lungs burned with exertion as I pushed Michael from behind, willing him to move faster. The lead coyote had gained ground, now less than 50 yards behind us. We crested the hill and found ourselves momentarily out of sight of the pack. I made a split-second decision, pulling Michael off the main trail onto a narrower deer path that cut through a dense thicket. "Through here," I hissed, pushing aside branches. "Quick!" We forced our way through the undergrowth, thorns catching on our clothing and scratching exposed skin. The new path was barely visible, but it took us on a sharp angle away from our original route. I hoped it might confuse the coyotes, at least temporarily. For a few blessed moments, I thought the plan had worked. The sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by our own labored breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. Then a howl cut through the forest, a signal that sent ice through my veins. Another howl answered from somewhere to our right, then another behind us. "They're surrounding us," Michael whispered, terror evident in his voice. I pulled him close, scanning the deepening shadows between the trees. The coyotes were using pack tactics, communicating positions to cut off our escape routes. As darkness fell, their advantage would only increase. "We need to find somewhere defensible," I said, thinking frantically. "Somewhere we can see them coming." The deer path emerged into a small clearing dominated by the massive trunk of a fallen oak. Its exposed root system created a natural barrier on one side, while the substantial trunk offered protection on another. "Here," I decided, pulling Michael toward the natural fortress. "Get behind the roots." He scrambled into position while I searched the ground for anything that could serve as a weapon. I found a sturdy branch about 4 feet long, one end splintered to a rough point where it had broken from the tree. The howls grew closer, converging on our position with unnerving accuracy. I positioned myself between the approaching sounds and my brother, gripping the makeshift spear with sweating hands. The first coyote appeared at the edge of the clearing, the same leader that had initiated the creek crossing. Its fur was a mottled gray-brown, its frame gaunt but powerful. Yellow eyes fixed on us with unnerving intelligence as it paced at the perimeter, waiting for its packmates to arrive. They emerged one by one until the entire group had us surrounded, maintaining a cautious distance from my brandished branch but showing no intention of retreating. Their coordinated behavior sent chills down my spine. This was not normal coyote conduct. Michael pressed against my back, trembling. "What do we do?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the lead coyote lowered its head and advanced. Twilight had fully descended now, the forest transformed into a world of deep shadows and muted sounds. The coyotes circled our position, their movements fluid and purposeful. I could distinguish them clearly enough to notice their individual characteristics. One with a torn ear, another with a distinctive white patch at its throat, the leader slightly larger than the others with a scar across its muzzle. I maintained a defensive stance, swinging the branch in wide arcs whenever one of them ventured too close. My arms ached from the effort, but fear provided a steady supply of adrenaline that kept fatigue at bay. "Stay behind me," I instructed Michael, who had pressed himself into the hollow formed by the tree's root system, "and get the whistle from my backpack." He fumbled with the zipper, his hands shaking so badly that the simple task took several attempts. Finally, he extracted the small metal whistle our mother had insisted we carry. "Blow it," I said, jabbing the branch toward a coyote that had inched forward on my left flank. 3 short blasts, then 3 long ones. That's the universal distress signal. Michael raised the whistle to his lips and blew the pattern as instructed. The piercing sound echoed through the clearing, causing several of the coyotes to flinch and retreat a few steps. He repeated the signal again and again, the sound seeming to expand in the dense air of the forest. I knew the chances of anyone hearing us were slim. We were at least a mile from the main trail, and most hikers would have left the park by now as darkness approached. Our parents wouldn't begin searching for at least another hour when we failed to meet them at the designated time. One of the coyotes, the one with the white throat patch, darted forward suddenly, testing my defenses. I swung the branch, connecting solidly with its shoulder. The animal yelped and retreated, but the brief victory was overshadowed by the realization that my strength was waning. I couldn't maintain this standoff indefinitely. "Michael," I said, keeping my eyes on the circling predators, "I need you to climb this tree." "What? I can't leave you down here. You're smaller and lighter. You can get higher than I can. Once you're safe, I'll follow." He hesitated, and I risked a glance over my shoulder to meet his terrified gaze. "Please, Michael, trust me." After a moment's hesitation, he nodded and began examining the fallen oak for a climbable section. The trunk itself was too broad and smooth, but where it had split upon falling, several large branches extended upward at manageable angles. "There," I said, nodding toward the most promising route. "Can you reach that first branch?" Michael stood on tiptoe, stretching his arms. "Almost. I'm going to boost you up," I decided. "When I say now, I want you to put your foot in my hands and I'll lift you." "But the coyotes..." "I'll be quick. Ready?" I kept the branch extended in my left hand, maintaining a semblance of our defensive perimeter. With my right, I formed a stirrup for Michael's foot. "Now!" He stepped into my cupped hands, and I heaved upward with all my remaining strength. Michael grabbed the branch, scrambling to pull himself onto it as I immediately returned to my defensive posture, swinging the branch in a wide arc to drive back a coyote that had seized the opportunity to advance. "I got it," Michael called from above. "I'm up." "Keep climbing," I instructed, relieved to see him scaling the tree with surprising agility. "Get as high as you safely can." With Michael temporarily secured, I began to assess my own escape options. The same route he had taken would be my best bet, but I would need to abandon my defensive position to attempt it. The moment I turned my back, the coyotes would rush in. As if sensing my dilemma, the pack leader edged closer, head low, muscles tensed for a spring. I jabbed the branch at it, but this time the animal didn't retreat. Instead, it snapped at the wood, teeth scraping loudly against the bark. "They're getting bolder," I called up to Michael, trying to keep panic from my voice. "Someone's coming!" he suddenly shouted. "I can see a light through the trees." I didn't dare look away from the coyotes to confirm his sighting. "Keep blowing the whistle." Michael resumed the SOS pattern, blasting the sound through the darkening forest with renewed vigor. I continued my defensive rotations, muscles burning with fatigue, praying he wasn't seeing things in his desperation. Then I heard it, a human voice calling from somewhere in the distance. "Hello? Is someone there?" "Here!" Michael and I shouted in unison. "We're here!" The coyotes seemed to register the new development, their circling becoming more agitated. The leader made a sudden lunge toward me, forcing me to swing the branch with all my remaining strength. The wood connected with its head, producing a yelp of pain as the animal retreated. "Help!" I screamed, my voice cracking with strain. "Coyotes!" The light Michael had spotted grew stronger, bobbing between trees as someone approached at a run. The beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the gloom, momentarily blinding me as it swept across our position. "Back here," called a deep voice, followed by the distinctive sound of multiple people crashing through the undergrowth. The coyotes hesitated, caught between their hunting instincts and their natural wariness of humans. The leader snarled, still focused on me despite the approaching rescue. A figure burst into the clearing, flashlight beam dancing wildly as he ran. Behind him came two more people, also carrying lights. "Get away from them!" the lead figure shouted, waving his arms and rushing toward the coyotes with remarkable courage. The pack scattered, melting into the darkness of the forest with reluctant growls. Just like that, the standoff was over, though I remained frozen in my defensive posture, unable to process the sudden shift from mortal danger to safety. "Are you hurt?" the man with the flashlight asked, approaching cautiously. He was middle-aged, dressed in hiking gear with a Park Service patch visible on his jacket. "Were you bitten?" I shook my head, still gripping the branch like a lifeline. My arms trembled from exertion, and my voice seemed trapped in my throat. "My brother," I finally managed to say, pointing upward with the branch. "He's in the tree." The ranger aimed his flashlight up, illuminating Michael's pale face among the branches. "Hello up there, young man," he called. "You can come down now. The coyotes are gone." Michael didn't move, frozen by a combination of fear and the paralyzing aftermath of adrenaline. One of the other rescuers, a woman in outdoor clothing, stepped forward. "I'll get him," she said, slinging her backpack to the ground. "I'm a climbing instructor." While she began to ascend the tree with practiced ease, the ranger turned his attention back to me. "I'm Ranger Wilson," he said, gently lowering my still-raised branch. "These are Jack and Renee. They heard your whistle while hiking and found me at a nearby marker." I nodded mechanically, struggling to process this information through the fog of exhaustion and fading terror. "Can you tell me what happened?" Wilson asked, guiding me to sit on a fallen log while keeping his flashlight trained on the surrounding darkness. In halting sentences, I described our encounter at the creek and the subsequent chase. As I spoke, the female climber, Renee, successfully coaxed Michael from his perch and helped him safely to the ground. He immediately ran to me, wrapping his arms around my waist with such force that it knocked the breath from my lungs. "You saved me," he whispered, his face pressed against my chest. I returned his embrace, the reality of our narrow escape finally hitting me with full force. Tears welled in my eyes as the magnitude of what we'd just survived registered. "Those coyotes were definitely acting abnormally," Wilson noted, frowning as he scanned the tree line. "We've had reports of unusual pack behavior in this section of the park, but nothing this aggressive. They shouldn't have pursued you like that. Could they be rabid? Asked Jack, the second hiker who had accompanied the ranger. Wilson shook his head. Possible, but unlikely for an entire pack. More likely they're desperately hungry. We've had drought conditions all summer, which has impacted their normal prey populations. He turned back to us. Your parents must be worried sick. Let's get you back to the visitor center. Michael refused to release his grip on me, so Jack offered to carry my backpack as we formed a tight group for the hike back. Ranger Wilson led the way, his powerful flashlight illuminating the trail, while Renee took the rear position, occasionally sweeping her own light through the trees to ensure the coyotes weren't following. Your quick thinking saved both of you, Wilson commented as we walked. Taking defensive position by that fallen tree, getting your brother up to safety, using the whistle, textbook wilderness survival tactics. I didn't feel deserving of his praise. All I had done was react instinctively, driven by the primal need to protect my younger brother. There had been no coherent plan, only a series of desperate decisions. I should never have let us stay so late, I said, guilt washing over me. I knew we needed to head back earlier. Don't be too hard on yourself, Renee called from behind. Predicting wildlife behavior isn't something most people can do, especially not teenagers on a day hike. We walked in silence for a while, the forest now fully dark around us, alive with night sounds that seemed harmless compared to what we had faced. Michael's grip on my waist gradually loosened as the immediate terror receded, though he remained unusually quiet. As we approached the main trail junction, distant shouts reached us, familiar voices calling our names with increasing desperation. That's our parents, I said, relief flooding through me. Wilson produced a radio from his belt and keyed the microphone. Base, this is Wilson. I've located the missing hikers. 2 juveniles, no injuries. We're approaching the main junction now. A crackling voice responded, confirming that our parents were with a search team near that location. Minutes later, we rounded a bend in the trail to find a cluster of flashlights bobbing toward us. My mother's voice rose above the others, raw with worry. When she saw us emerge from the darkness, she broke into a run, my father close behind. The reunion was a blur of tears and fierce embraces. My mother alternated between scolding us for being late and expressing profound relief at our safety. My father, normally reserved with his emotions, held us both so tightly I could feel his heartbeat through his jacket. Coyotes chased us, Michael explained, his voice muffled against our mother's shoulder. Like a whole pack of them. They tried to eat us, but I climbed a tree and kept blowing the whistle like you showed us. My parents' expressions shifted from relief to horror as they absorbed this information. The ranger stepped forward to explain the situation more fully, emphasizing the unusual nature of the encounter while subtly downplaying the mortal danger we had faced. The drive home that night was subdued. Michael fell asleep against me in the back seat, exhaustion claiming him before we had even left the park boundaries. My parents spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing back at us with expressions that mixed lingering fear with profound gratitude. I remained awake, replaying the day's events in my mind. The golden afternoon light at the creek, the first glimpse of reflective eyes in the underbrush, the sound of paws on forest floor, the circle of predators closing in. These images played on a continuous loop, refusing to fade despite my physical exhaustion. When we arrived home, my father carried the still sleeping Michael to his bedroom. My mother insisted on examining me for injuries I might have overlooked in the chaos. She cleaned the scratches on my arms from pushing through the thicket, applying antiseptic that stung less than the thorns had. You saved your brother's life today, she said quietly as she worked, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. I don't even want to think about what could have happened if... But it didn't happen, I interrupted, unable to bear the thought myself. She nodded, pressing her lips together to maintain composure. Get some rest, she finally said, kissing my forehead. We'll talk more tomorrow. But sleep proved elusive that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the lead coyote's intense gaze, felt the weight of the branch in my hands, heard Michael's terrified breathing. When exhaustion finally pulled me under near dawn, my dreams were filled with endless pursuits through darkened forests. The next morning, local news carried a brief story about our encounter. Ranger Wilson had reported the incident, prompting park officials to temporarily close that section of trail while they investigated the unusual coyote behavior. Wildlife experts were quoted speculating about possible causes. habitat disruption from recent construction, disease, changes in prey patterns due to drought. Michael developed a brief but intense fear of dogs in the weeks that followed. Even our neighbor's elderly golden retriever, previously a favorite playmate, sent him scrambling for safety behind the nearest adult. This gradually faded, though he maintained a healthy wariness around unfamiliar animals. For me, the psychological impact was more subtle. I became hypervigilant in outdoor settings, constantly scanning surroundings for potential threats. The sound of branches breaking in woods made my heart race. Night walks, once enjoyable, became exercises in controlled anxiety. Yet, alongside these lingering fears, I discovered something unexpected about myself, a capacity for decisive action under extreme pressure. The memory of standing between those predators and my brother, terrified but determined, revealed a core of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. 3 months after our encounter, I returned to the Daniel Boone National Forest. I went alone, despite my parents' concerns, driven by some internal need to reclaim the peace I had once found in natural settings. I didn't venture to the same trail, choosing instead a popular route near the visitor center, well-trafficked and regularly patrolled. Standing among the autumn-painted trees, listening to the familiar forest sounds, I felt the last tendrils of persistent fear begin to loosen their grip. The wilderness had shown me its dangers, yes, but also taught me something valuable about myself and the primal bonds of family. That day in the forest had marked us, Michael and me, in ways both visible and invisible. The scratches on our skin had healed quickly, leaving no scars. The psychological imprints would take longer to fade, but they too would eventually transform, not disappearing entirely, but evolving into something else. Wisdom, perhaps, or respect for the untamed world that exists alongside our carefully ordered lives. As I hiked back toward the visitor center that autumn day, I spotted a lone coyote watching from a distant ridge. Our eyes met briefly across the expanse, predator and prey in momentary acknowledgement, before it turned and melted into the trees, a reminder that some boundaries, once crossed, forever change how we perceive the wilderness around us and the wilderness within. The file labeled Black Mountain Incident sat on my desk, worn at the edges from countless late-night reviews. Senior Field Agent Ulysses Mercer, Department of Cryptozoological Containment and Research. That's my official title, though few outside our underground facility would recognize it. I work for what we informally call the Division, a covert branch operating beneath the layers of conventional government oversight. Our mission statement, if you could call it that, is deceptively simple. Investigate, document, and when necessary, neutralize cryptid threats. Let me be clear. These aren't the benign creatures of campfire stories or the commercialized monsters that adorn children's cereal boxes. The entities we track are biological anomalies that defy conventional science, predators that have adapted to exist in the shadows of human civilization. They are real, they are dangerous, and they are far more numerous than the general public could ever comprehend without mass panic. I've spent 15 years with the Division, recruited after a tour in Afghanistan where I encountered something in a remote mountain cave that my military superiors were eager to classify as insurgent activity. It wasn't. Whatever killed those men was ancient and methodical, leaving behind evidence that contradicted every known predator profile. The Division found me before I could file my report, and I've been working for them ever since. This job has cost me a normal life. 2 failed marriages, a daughter who believes I work as a wildlife consultant, a perpetual sense of hypervigilance that makes civilian life feel like a poorly crafted facade. But I stay because someone needs to stand between the everyday world and the horrors that lurk just beyond perception. The Black Mountain operation began like most, with unexplained disappearances and deaths that local authorities couldn't reconcile with conventional explanations. 8 hikers had vanished over 3 months, and 4 bodies had been discovered in conditions that the county coroner refused to detail in official documentation. The local sheriff, overwhelmed and desperate, reached out through channels that eventually filtered to our department. Our 4-person team assembled at headquarters in Arlington. Captain Mason Briggs led the operation, a former Delta Force operator with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had seen too much. Mason had recruited me years ago and became the closest thing to a friend this line of work allowed. His tactical planning was meticulous, his leadership unquestioned. Sarah Chen, our technology specialist, was relatively new to field operations but brilliant with both conventional and specialized equipment. She had developed several of our tracking devices and had an uncanny ability to establish patterns where others saw only chaos. At 32, she maintained an optimism that seemed increasingly out of place in our line of work. Logan Pierce completed our team, a former Forest Service tracker whose encounter with something in the Olympic National Forest had left him with a facial scar and an unwavering dedication to our cause. His understanding of wilderness terrain and animal behavior made him invaluable, though his tendency toward isolation concerned Mason. We flew into Asheville on a crisp October morning, the mountains surrounding the airport ablaze with autumn colors that belied the darkness we were there to confront. Mason had arranged for an unmarked SUV, and we drove the winding roads to Black Mountain in silence, each of us reviewing the case files one last time. The town itself seemed pulled from a postcard. Historic buildings lining a quaint main street, local shops with hand-painted signs, and residents who offered friendly nods as we passed. But beneath this veneer of small-town charm, I could sense the tension. Store owners watched customers with suspicious eyes. Parents kept children close. The forest that surrounded the town, usually a tourist draw this time of year, stood strangely empty of hikers. Sheriff Davis met us at the local station, a single-story brick building that housed the town's modest police force. He and Mason embraced briefly. They had served together years before, in some capacity neither ever fully explained. "I can't tell you how glad I am you're here," Davis said, leading us to a back room where maps and photos covered the walls. "We're out of our depth, and people are scared. 3 more residents have packed up and left town this week alone." The sheriff pulled down a topographical map of the surrounding wilderness. Red pins marked disappearance locations. Blue pins indicated where bodies had been recovered. As Mason had noted in our briefing, they formed a rough circle around an area locally known as Devil's Hollow. "Locals have stories about that place going back generations," Davis explained, his finger tracing the outline of the hollow. "Most dismissed it as superstition, myself included. But whatever's out there—" He paused, swallowing hard. "The bodies we found were torn apart, not like a bear or mountain lion. More deliberate." He pulled out photos I hadn't seen in our briefing packet. The images showed dismemberment patterns that were horrifically methodical, limbs arranged in geometrical patterns, organs extracted with surgical precision. I'd seen similar configurations before, in cases involving entities that displayed rudimentary ritualistic behavior. "We're telling the public it's a rogue bear," Davis continued, his voice dropping. "But my deputy quit last week after seeing the 3rd victim. Said no animal he knows could do that." Mason studied the map, his expression grave. "We'll need a base of operations, somewhere private but close to the hollow." Davis nodded. "I've got a hunting cabin my family owns. It's been vacant since my father passed. No one will bother you there, and it's about 2 miles from the edge of the hollow." As we prepared to leave, Sarah analyzed the cellular signal strength in the area while Logan examined weather forecasts and terrain maps. I stepped outside with Mason for a private word. "What aren't you telling me about this place?" I asked quietly. Mason's jaw tightened. "Division archives have a file on Black Mountain from 1954, classified beyond our usual protocols. I couldn't access the details, but it was flagged with containment failure status." My stomach dropped. Containment failure was our organization's euphemism for operations where agents were lost and the entity remained at large. "You think it's the same thing?" I asked. "I think," Mason replied, watching as Davis loaded our equipment into the SUV, "that this town has seen this before, and whatever happened last time, the division couldn't stop it." The cabin sat nestled among towering pines, its wooden exterior weathered by decades of mountain seasons. A wraparound porch offered views of the surrounding forest, though the beauty was diminished by our knowledge of what potentially lurked within it. Inside, the space was surprisingly well maintained. 2 bedrooms, a large main room with a stone fireplace, and a kitchen with dated but functional appliances. Sarah immediately claimed the dining table for her equipment, establishing communication links with headquarters and setting up our monitoring systems. Logan began organizing our tactical gear while Mason and I surveyed the perimeter. The locals avoid Devil's Hollow, Mason said as we walked the property line. But Davis says teenagers occasionally dare each other to venture in. None of the victims were local kids, though. All outsiders or newer residents. Suggesting whatever's out there knows who belongs and who doesn't, I noted. Or the locals know better than to enter its territory. As darkness fell, we gathered around Sarah's digital map projection. Our mission parameters were clear. Identify the entity, assess the threat level, contain or neutralize if possible, and minimize public awareness. Tomorrow we begin reconnaissance, Mason said, his voice steady and authoritative. We move in pairs, Sarah with Logan to the northeastern quadrant, Ulysses with me to the northwest. We establish sensor perimeters and gather environmental data. None of us mentioned the unspoken reality that division reconnaissance missions often served as bait to draw out the very predators we hunted. That night, as the others slept, I stood on the porch staring into the darkness beyond our floodlights. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No owls called, no nocturnal creatures rustled in the underbrush. Just the soft whisper of wind through pine needles and the persistent feeling that something was watching, waiting, assessing our presence with a calculating intelligence. I'd felt this before, this weight of malevolent observation. It never preceded anything good. Morning arrived with a heavy mist that clung to the forest floor, transforming the landscape into something from a Gothic painting. We ate in silence, each mentally preparing for what lay ahead. Sarah checked her tablet, reviewing the data collected by her perimeter sensors overnight. Nothing triggered the motion detectors, she reported, frowning. But the thermal imaging picked up something large moving just beyond range around 3 a.m. It circled the cabin twice before disappearing back toward the hollow. Logan's hand unconsciously moved to the hunting knife at his belt. It's aware of us already. It was aware before we arrived, I said, remembering the unnatural silence of the previous night. We're in its territory now. Mason spread a map across the kitchen counter, marking our planned survey routes with a red marker. We stick to the plan. 4-hour reconnaissance, radio check every 20 minutes. If you encounter anything at all that seems unusual, you report immediately and fall back to these rally points. He circled 3 locations equidistant from the cabin. We geared up methodically. Standard division field equipment included modified tactical vests with ceramic plating, specialized ammunition designed for various cryptid physiologies, encrypted communication devices, and environmental sensors. Each agent also carried personal items suited to their expertise. Logan's custom-made tracking kit, Sarah's handheld spectral analyzer, my ultraviolet detection equipment, and Mason's advanced targeting system. As Mason and I headed northwest, the forest seemed to close around us, the trees growing denser and more twisted the further we ventured from the cabin. The ground gradually sloped downward, the soil becoming softer, almost spongy beneath our boots. We're entering the northeastern edge of Devil's Hollow, Mason confirmed, checking his GPS. Geological surveys show this whole area sits atop an underground stream system. The atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive as we descended deeper into the hollow. Sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy, creating dappled patterns that seemed to shift and move even when the branches above remained still. The air felt heavier, carrying a faint metallic scent that caught in the back of my throat. "You smell that?" I asked Mason. He nodded, his expression grim. "Blood. Old blood." We followed the scent to a small clearing where the vegetation had been flattened in a perfect circle approximately 20 feet in diameter. The ground at the center was stained dark, and fragments of what appeared to be bone were scattered throughout the matted grass. Mason crouched, examining the scene without touching anything. "This isn't recent. These stains have weathered at least 2 rainfalls." I circled the perimeter, noting how precisely the vegetation had been compressed. This wasn't random animal activity. The circumference is too exact. Using a sterile collection kit, I gathered samples of the stained soil and bone fragments, carefully labeling each for Sarah to analyze later. Mason photographed the scene from multiple angles, his movements efficient and practiced. "Radio check with the others," I suggested, feeling increasingly uneasy in the clearing. Mason activated his communication device. "Team 2, status report." Static crackled for several seconds before Sarah's voice came through, distorted but understandable. "We're approximately 2 miles east of your position. Logan's found something." unusual. Tracks leading to a cave system not marked on our maps. "What kind of tracks?" Mason asked, his body tensing. "Nothing I've ever seen," Logan's voice broke through. "Bipedal, but with a stride length suggesting something larger than human, clawed, and they appear and disappear randomly, as if whatever made them can phase in and out of solid ground." Mason and I exchanged glances. Phasing entities were rare and particularly dangerous, able to appear suddenly without warning. "Document but do not follow into the cave," Mason ordered. "We'll regroup at the cabin in 2 hours to compare findings." As we prepared to leave the clearing, a sound stopped us both. A low, rhythmic thumping, like a massive heartbeat emanating from beneath the forest floor. It continued for precisely 30 seconds before stopping abruptly, leaving an absence more disturbing than the sound itself. "We need to move," Mason said quietly, his hand moving to his sidearm. We maintained a swift pace back through the forest, both hyper-aware of our surroundings. Twice, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, something dark and fluid sliding between distant trees, but each time I turned, nothing was there. The cabin came into view just as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Sarah and Logan had already returned, their expressions tense as they helped us secure the perimeter. Inside, we laid out our findings. Sarah's analysis of the soil samples revealed traces of human DNA from multiple individuals, along with an unidentified organic compound that didn't match anything in our database. Logan's plaster casts of the tracks showed a foot structure that combined human and feline characteristics, with claws that extended nearly 3 inches from the toes. "The locals have a name for what they think lives in these woods," Logan said, placing a small, worn book on the table. "I found this in town this morning before we left. It's a collection of regional folklore compiled in the 1930s. He opened to a marked page featuring a crude illustration of a tall, emaciated figure with elongated limbs and a featureless face. The caption read, "The Hollow Walker, said to emerge from Devil's Hollow during times of strife to claim those who trespass on its domain." Folklore often contains kernels of truth, Mason noted, studying the illustration. "But I've never encountered an entity matching this description in division records." Sarah's tablet chimed, interrupting our discussion. "Proximity alert," she announced, moving to her monitor display. Something triggered the sensors 100 yards north of the cabin. We moved into defensive positions, dimming the lights and readying our weapons. Through the reinforced windows, the forest had grown completely dark, the nighttime shadows seeming to pulsate with unnatural density. "Movement, 10 o'clock, Logan whispered, his enhanced night vision goggles scanning the tree line. I followed his gaze, adjusting my own optics to compensate for the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, it was there. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its proportions wrong in ways that defied anatomical logic. It stood at least 7 feet tall, with limbs too long and joints that bent in impossible directions. Its skin, if it could be called that, seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a silhouette of perfect darkness against the night. "Dear God," Sarah breathed beside me. The figure remained motionless for precisely 60 seconds, as if evaluating our presence. Then it tilted its head at an angle no human neck could achieve and stepped backward into the forest, disappearing instantly. "It didn't trigger the motion sensors when it left," Sarah said, checking her tablet with trembling hands. "That's not possible. It would have had to cross the perimeter." "Unless it didn't leave physically," I suggested, the implications chilling me. "Unless it phased out, just like the tracks Logan found." Mason made the decision we'd all been considering. "We contact headquarters for backup. This entity's capabilities exceed our containment protocols." When he attempted to establish a secure communication link, however, we discovered all external signals were being blocked by an unknown interference. We were isolated, cut off from division support, with something hunting us that defied our understanding of physical laws. "We need to reconsider our approach," Mason said, his calm voice belying the gravity of our situation. "This isn't reconnaissance anymore, it's survival." Dawn arrived with an unnatural fog that clung to the windows of the cabin, so thick it obscured the world beyond our walls. None of us had slept much after the previous night's encounter, taking shifts to monitor the perimeter sensors that had remained stubbornly silent despite what we'd seen. "I've analyzed the data from last night," Sarah said, dark circles under her eyes as she showed us her findings. There was a localized electromagnetic pulse just before the entity appeared, and another when it vanished. Whatever this thing is, it's generating enough energy to disrupt our communications and possibly bend light around itself. Logan paced the small kitchen, his usual stoic demeanor fractured by nervous energy. The tracks I found lead to a cave system that might explain the disappearances. If it's dragging victims underground, we need to locate its lair. Mason considered this, his expression calculating. Going underground with an entity that can move through solid matter would be suicide with our current resources. We need to force it into a position where its advantages are minimized. I studied the topographical map, focusing on the circular pattern of disappearances. It's territorial. The attacks form a perimeter around its hunting ground. What if we're thinking about this backward? What if Devil's Hollow isn't where it lives, but what it's protecting? Mason leaned over the map, following my reasoning. Something at the center of the hollow that it guards. That would explain the ritualistic arrangement of the bodies, their warnings, not feeding patterns. Or offerings, Logan suggested grimly. We formulated a new plan. Instead of hunting the entity directly, we would approach the center of Devil's Hollow to discover what it was protecting. Mason and I would make the approach while Sarah maintained communication from the cabin, and Logan established a secure extraction route. As we prepared to depart, I noticed Sarah discreetly loading a specialized division weapon we called a pulse disruptor, a last resort device designed to temporarily destabilize the molecular cohesion of phasing entities. The fact that she'd brought one suggested she'd suspected what we might encounter from the beginning. Headquarters briefed you separately, didn't they? I asked quietly while Mason and Logan checked the perimeter. She hesitated before answering. They have suspicions about what's happening here based on historical patterns. They didn't want to bias the field assessment with speculation. That's not protocol, I noted, feeling a flare of frustration at being kept in the dark. This entity has been encountered before, she admitted. Not just in the 50s. Records show similar disappearance patterns in 1897, 1954, and 1987. Each time, the division or its predecessors attempted intervention. Each time, they failed. The revelation settled like ice in my stomach. Why send us in with incomplete information? Sarah's eyes met mine, her expression troubled. Because the pattern is accelerating. The intervals between emergence events are shortening. They need data, and they need it now. Before I could respond, Mason returned, signaling it was time to move out. The conversation would have to wait, but questions burned in my mind as we departed, making our way deeper into the hollow than we'd ventured before. The fog thinned as we descended, but the forest grew increasingly strange. Trees twisted into unnatural shapes, their bark blackened as if scorched. The ground beneath our feet transitioned from soil to a slick, stone-like surface that resembled hardened obsidian. Small pools of standing water dotted the landscape, each perfectly circular and still as glass. Environmental contamination, Mason observed, taking readings with his handheld scanner. Radiation levels are elevated, but not immediately dangerous. We continued downward, following a natural depression in the landscape that gradually narrowed into what appeared to be a dried streambed. The obsidian-like material grew more prevalent, forming ridges and swirls that resembled frozen liquid. This looks like volcanic glass, I said, examining the surface. But there's no volcanic activity recorded in this region. Not geological activity, Mason corrected, his voice tight. Something else generated enough heat to vitrify the soil. The streambed led to a circular basin approximately 50 yards in diameter, entirely composed of the black glass-like substance. At its center stood a perfectly cylindrical stone column about 7 feet tall, covered in markings that resembled no language I'd ever encountered. "This is it," Mason whispered, his eyes fixed on the column. "This is what it's protecting." As we approached cautiously, our radios crackled to life with Sarah's voice, distorted but urgent. "Movement detected, multiple signatures converging on your position. Get out now." Before we could react, a sound rippled through the basin, the same rhythmic thumping we'd heard in the clearing, but amplified tenfold, reverberating through the ground beneath our feet. The obsidian surface began to vibrate, hairline fractures spreading outward from the column. "Back to the perimeter," Mason ordered, drawing his weapon as we retreated toward the edge of the basin. We'd made it halfway when the entity appeared. not gradually as before, but instantaneously, standing between us and our escape route. In daylight, its form was even more disturbing, a humanoid figure whose proportions shifted subtly as it moved, its skin a matte black that seemed to absorb the very light around it. Its face was smooth and featureless, except for what appeared to be a vertical slit where a mouth should be. Mason fired without hesitation, the specialized rounds designed to disrupt cryptid physiologies. The entity jerked as the bullet struck, but showed no signs of serious injury. Instead, it moved toward us with uncanny speed, covering 10 yards in a single fluid motion. "Split up!" Mason shouted, diving to the right while I went left. The creature paused, its head swiveling between us before choosing to pursue Mason. I fired repeatedly at its back, trying to distract it, but it moved with singular purpose, closing the distance to Mason in seconds. What happened next occurred so quickly, I could barely process it. Mason fired again, the bullet striking the entity's chest. It seemed to ripple, and then its arm extended impossibly, crossing the space between them in a blur. Claws that hadn't been visible before slashed across Mason's torso, tearing through his tactical vest as if it were paper. Mason stumbled backward, blood spreading across his chest, but maintained his footing long enough to pull a phosphorus flare from his belt. He ignited it, the brilliant white light causing the entity to recoil momentarily. "The column!" Mason shouted, his voice strained with pain. "Destroy the column!" I ran toward the stone structure, drawing my combat knife infused with silver and iron alloys, materials that had proven effective against various cryptid physiologies. Behind me, I heard Mason's continued gunfire, then a terrible wet sound and his abrupt silence. The column's surface felt strangely warm beneath my hands, the alien markings seeming to shift and move as I touched them. I drove my knife into what appeared to be a central symbol, applying my full strength. The blade sank in with unexpected ease, and a high-pitched keening filled the air. The entire basin shuddered, and the black surface beneath my feet began to liquefy. I turned to see the entity standing over Mason's motionless form, its featureless face now split by a gaping vertical maw lined with needle-like teeth. It noticed my action and moved toward me with terrifying speed, but before it could reach me, the ground between us erupted. 3 more identical entities emerged from the liquefying obsidian, surrounding me in a perfect triangle formation. My radio crackled again with Logan's voice. "Ulysses, we're coming in. Hold position." Before I could respond, one of the entities lunged. I dodged, but another was already behind me, its elongated fingers wrapping around my arm with crushing strength. The skin where it touched burned like acid, and I felt a strange numbness spreading from the contact point. In desperation, I activated a UV flash grenade, a standard tool against creatures with photosensitivity. The basin filled with blinding ultraviolet light, and the effect was immediate. The entities released inhuman screams, their skin blistering and smoking where the light touched them. I broke free and ran toward Mason, grabbing his body and dragging him toward the edge of the basin. The entities recovered quickly, pursuing us with fury, now replacing their earlier methodical movements. Just as they closed in, gunfire erupted from the ridge above the basin. Logan and Sarah had arrived, providing covering fire from elevated positions. Sarah deployed the pulse disruptor, the device emitting concentric waves of energy that caused the entities to flicker like faulty television signals. "The column!" I shouted up to them. "We need to destroy it completely." Logan nodded, retrieving something from his pack, a Division-issue demolition charge. He calibrated it quickly before tossing it down to me. I caught it and turned back toward the column, which was now pulsating with an internal light that cast sickly green shadows across the basin. The entities seemed aware of my intention, their movements becoming frenzied as they attempted to reach me through the disruption field. One partially materialized through the ground directly in front of me, its half-formed body writhing as the pulse disruptor tore at its molecular structure. I sidestepped its flailing limbs and reached the column, placing the charge at its base and activating the timer for 30 seconds. The countdown began as I retreated, supporting Mason's limp form as best I could while Sarah and Logan continued their suppressing fire. We had just cleared the ridge when the charge detonated. The explosion was strangely muted, as if the sound were being absorbed, but the shockwave that followed knocked us all off our feet. A column of greenish light shot upward from where the stone had stood, piercing the clouds above before collapsing back in upon itself. The screams that followed, weren't like anything I'd heard before. Not just the entities in the basin, but a chorus of inhuman voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The forest around us shuddered, trees bending toward the hollow as if caught in a powerful wind. And then, silence. Absolute and complete. Mason lay still beside me, his chest barely rising with shallow breaths. Blood soaked through his tactical vest, but he was alive, barely. Logan helped me lift him while Sarah covered our retreat, the pulse disruptor held ready, though no further entities appeared. As we made our way back toward the cabin, I glanced back at Devil's Hollow. The unnatural fog was lifting, and for a moment I thought I saw the outline of something massive beneath the forest floor. A geometric shape too perfect to be natural, too alien to be human construction. Then the trees shifted, and it was gone. Mason had been right. This wasn't just a hunting ground for a cryptid predator. It was something older, something that had been here long before the town of Black Mountain existed, and we had disturbed it. We reached the cabin as dusk settled over the mountains, the fading light casting long shadows through the trees. Mason's condition had deteriorated during our retreat, his breathing labored, skin ashen beneath the blood and dirt. Whatever the entity had done to him went beyond physical injury. There was a spreading darkness beneath his skin that followed the veins outward from the wound. Sarah converted the dining table into a makeshift medical station, applying field trauma protocols while Logan secured the perimeter. I contacted Sheriff Davis on our emergency radio frequency, requesting immediate medical evacuation while deliberately omitting the nature of our encounter. "I'll have a helicopter at the clearing a mile north of your position in 40 minutes, Davis responded, his voice tight with concern. "Will you tell me what the hell happened out there? The whole town felt that, whatever it was. Knocked out power across the county." "Prepare for casualties," I replied, avoiding his question. "And Sheriff, don't let anyone near Devil's Hollow. Not your deputies, not search and rescue. No one." While we waited for evacuation, Sarah's analysis of Mason's condition confirmed my fears. The wound isn't responding to any standard treatments. There's some kind of foreign cellular material spreading through his system, almost like a parasitic infection, but it's not behaving like any pathogen I've ever seen. I studied the obsidian-like material I'd collected from the hollow, now contained in a division-issue isolation case. Under Sarah's portable microscope, the substance revealed a crystalline structure that periodically shifted and realigned itself without any apparent stimulus. "It's still active," I noted, watching the microscopic movements. "Even separated from the source." Logan joined us, his expression grim. "Perimeter sensors are all clear, but the electromagnetic disturbance is increasing. Whatever we disrupted down there is still reacting." Sarah adjusted Mason's IV, her hands steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "The column, what do you think it was? A containment structure? A communication device? Or a plug?" I suggested, the terrible possibility forming in my mind. What if Devil's Hollow isn't just a name? What if it's exactly what it sounds like? A hollow space beneath the mountain, and that column was keeping something from coming through. Before anyone could respond, Mason's eyes flew open, his body arching in sudden rigidity. When he spoke, his voice carried a harmonic distortion that raised the hair on my arms. "The gate stands open," he said, the words seeming to echo though he barely whispered. "The sleepers wake. You've broken the seal." His hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. Where his skin touched mine, I felt a cold that penetrated to the bone, and with it came flashes of imagery. The hollow from below, a vast chamber filled with symmetrical structures of the same obsidian material, and within them, shapes that shifted and moved with alien geometries. Logan pulled Mason's hand away, breaking the connection. Mason collapsed back onto the table, unconscious again, but now trembling violently. "He's been compromised," Logan said quietly, his hand moving to his sidearm. "Division protocol is clear for contamination scenarios." "No," I stepped between them, though I knew Logan was right. Protocol dictated that personnel showing signs of cryptid infection or possession were to be neutralized immediately to prevent further spread. "We get him to the evacuation point. The medical team can establish containment." Sarah's tablet chimed with an urgent alert. "Seismic activity beneath Devil's Hollow. Multiple tremors registering at increasing intervals." Outside, the forest had gone silent again. that same unnatural quiet we'd experienced on our first night, but deeper now, as if the entire mountain were holding its breath. We move now, I decided, gathering our essential equipment. Whatever's happening, we need to be clear of this area when it escalates. We fashioned a stretcher for Mason from blankets and curtain rods, securing him as best we could before heading out into the gathering darkness. The hike to the evacuation point would take approximately 30 minutes at our current pace, burdened as we were with Mason's unconscious form. The forest had changed since our arrival. Trees that had stood for centuries now leaned at unnatural angles, their roots partially exposed as if the soil beneath had shifted. The ground itself felt unstable, subtly vibrating beneath our boots. Most disturbing were the shadows, deeper than natural darkness should allow, pooling in hollows and depressions with an almost liquid quality. We had covered perhaps half the distance to the evacuation point when Mason began convulsing again, his body twisting against the restraints we'd placed to secure him to the stretcher. His eyes opened, revealing pupils that had expanded to consume the iris entirely, and the veins in his neck and face stood out in stark relief, pulsing with that same darkness we'd observed earlier. "It comes," he gasped, his voice still carrying that unnatural harmonic. "The gateway between. The space between spaces. You invited it." Logan and I struggled to hold the stretcher steady as Mason's convulsions intensified. Sarah administered a sedative from our medical kit, but it seemed to have no effect. "We need to keep moving," I insisted, though Logan's expression clearly indicated his growing conviction that Mason was beyond saving. Suddenly, Mason went completely still. His eyes, still unnaturally black, fixed on a point somewhere above and beyond us. We all instinctively followed his gaze upward. The night sky had changed. Where stars should have been visible between the canopy gaps, there was instead a shifting, folding darkness that seemed to bend and distort the very fabric of space. As we watched, transfixed, a vertical line appeared in this darkness, not a tear or a hole, but a deliberate parting, like massive eyelids opening to reveal something beyond. "Run," Mason whispered, his voice suddenly his own again, filled with desperate urgency. "Ulysses, get them out. It's not just one entity. It's a colony, a hive, and the Queen is coming through." Before I could respond, the ground beneath us heaved violently, sending us all sprawling. The stretcher overturned, and Mason was thrown several feet away, landing heavily against a tree trunk. Logan recovered first, pulling Sarah to her feet while I scrambled toward Mason. What happened next remains fragmented in my memory, like pieces of a nightmare that my mind refuses to assemble into a coherent whole. The earth between Mason and me split open, a fissure appearing that widened with frightening speed. From within this opening emerged not one entity, but dozens, smaller versions of what we'd encountered in the hollow, their bodies flowing up from the depths like liquid darkness given form. Mason met my eyes one last time across the growing chasm, a moment of perfect clarity amidst the chaos. "The column was a warning, not a prison," he called out. "They've been here all along, beneath us, waiting." Then the entities reached him, surrounding his prone form in a writhing mass of elongated limbs and featureless faces. I drew my weapon, firing blindly into the swarm, but they moved with that same impossible physics, bullets passing through spaces where they should have been only to find emptiness. "Ulysses!" Logan shouted from behind me, firing his own weapon at entities that had begun to emerge from other fissures opening throughout the forest floor. "We need to move now." The rational part of my mind knew he was right, knew that Mason was already lost, but some deeper instinct refused to abandon him. I continued forward, leaping across the narrowest part of the chasm separating us. I landed heavily on the other side, rolling to absorb the impact, and came up firing at the nearest entities. They recoiled from the specialized ammunition, but there were too many, and my magazine emptied too quickly. As I reached to reload, one of them moved with that blurring speed, appearing directly before me. Up close, its facial slit parted to reveal not just teeth, but a complex arrangement of pulsating membranes that emitted a high-frequency sound that disoriented me instantly. My vision swam, balance failing as the sound penetrated deeper than my ears, seeming to resonate within my skull itself. Through the disorientation, I saw Mason's body begin to change, his form elongating, joints bending at impossible angles as the darkness spread across his skin completely. What rose from the ground where he had lain was no longer human, but a hybrid abomination. his features still recognizable but distorted, as if his body were merely a vessel being worn by something else. The Mason thing turned toward me, the movement fluid and wrong, and spoke with a voice that layered Mason's familiar tones over something ancient and cold. The division between worlds was always thinner here. Your interference has ruptured it completely. They come now, all of them. I felt hands grabbing me from behind. Logan and Sarah had crossed the chasm to retrieve me. The entity that had been Mason made no move to stop us as they dragged me backward, away from the spreading swarm of smaller entities that continued to pour from the earth. "The helicopter," Sarah gasped, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "It's waiting. We need to go." As we retreated, I saw other figures emerging from the trees, townspeople, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, eyes reflecting the same complete blackness we'd seen in Mason. They didn't pursue us, instead converging on the largest fissure where the Mason thing stood like a sentinel. We reached the evacuation point, a small clearing now illuminated by the searchlight of a waiting helicopter. Sheriff Davis himself stood at the edge of the clearing, shotgun in hand, watching the forest with evident terror. "What the hell did you people do?" he shouted over the roar of the rotors as we approached. "The whole mountain's coming apart." Indeed, behind us, the landscape was transforming. Trees toppled as the ground continued to heave and split. The unnatural darkness in the sky had spread, now covering the entire visible firmament above Devil's Hollow. We boarded the helicopter without answering, and as it lifted off, I watched through the side window as the transformation accelerated. The forest canopy began to collapse inward, trees and earth disappearing into a growing depression that rapidly expanded outward from the center of Devil's Hollow. The last thing I saw before we banked away was the Mason thing standing at the edge of this growing abyss, its head tilted upward toward the rent in the sky, arms extended in a gesture of welcoming or supplication to whatever was descending from that impossible darkness. The official report classified the Black Mountain incident as a geological event, a localized sinkhole formation resulting from previously undetected limestone caverns beneath the mountain. The town was evacuated under the pretense of environmental hazards, the area quarantined by agencies whose acronyms conveyed authority without transparency. Division cleanup teams moved in within hours, establishing a containment perimeter that extended 3 miles in every direction from the center of Devil's Hollow. Satellite imagery of the region was scrubbed and replaced with composite visuals that showed nothing more alarming than standard forest recovery from a natural disaster. 3 weeks after our extraction, I sat in a sterile debriefing room at Division headquarters, recounting the events for the 5th time to a panel of senior officials whose expressions revealed nothing of their thoughts. Sarah and Logan had been similarly debriefed, then reassigned to separate units, standard procedure for teams that experienced catastrophic mission failure. "Agent Mercer," the senior official addressed me, her tone carefully neutral. "Your report indicates that Captain Briggs was compromised by an entity of unknown origin, yet you delayed neutralization protocols. Do you stand by this decision?" "I do," I answered, my voice steady despite the exhaustion that had become my constant companion since Black Mountain. At that point, we still believed evacuation and containment were viable options. What I couldn't say within the confines of official reporting, was how Mason's eyes had found mine in that last moment of humanity, silently pleading for me to get the others to safety rather than attempt a futile rescue. Some debts can't be paid in full, only honored through the protection of others. The debriefing concluded with my reassignment to non-field duties pending psychological evaluation, a bureaucratic euphemism for being shelved until they determined whether the experience had broken me beyond repair. In the months that followed, I observed from a distance as the division implemented what they called the Black Mountain Protocol, a systematic approach to studying and containing the phenomenon that had emerged there. Monitoring stations established around the perimeter reported continuous electromagnetic and gravitational anomalies emanating from the center of the former hollow, now a perfect circular depression nearly a mile in diameter and of indeterminate depth. Unmanned drones sent into the depression never returned. Remote sensing equipment failed within minutes of deployment. The only data that consistently transmitted were audio recordings, capturing that same rhythmic thumping we'd heard in the forest, now amplified 100-fold and maintaining a precise cadence day and night without variation. Official division theory classified what we'd encountered as a previously unknown form of invasive extra-dimensional entity, a hive organism capable of existing partially in our reality while maintaining its primary mass in another dimensional plane. The column we destroyed was theorized to be an ancient containment mechanism, possibly constructed by previous human civilizations who had encountered the entity and managed to restrict its access to our reality. I knew the truth was both simpler and more terrifying. We hadn't just encountered something alien. We had awakened something that had always been there, something that existed in the spaces between conventional reality, perceiving our world as we might perceive a two-dimensional drawing. The entities weren't invading, they were emerging, like fingers pushing through the surface of a pond to test the air above. 6 months after Black Mountain, I was cleared for limited field duty and assigned to the Historical Research Division, a lateral move that kept me involved while limiting my direct contact with active operations. My new role involved examining historical records for patterns matching what we now called holotype entities, searching for previous encounters throughout human history. What I found disturbed me deeply. Cave paintings dating back 30,000 years depicted elongated figures with featureless faces. Medieval manuscripts described men of shadow who walked through walls and stole children during times of plague. Native American tribal history spoke of thin places in the landscape where the boundary between worlds wore thin, and guardians were appointed to maintain ritual structures that kept the hungry ones at bay. Most significantly, I discovered that Black Mountain wasn't unique. Similar geological formations existed worldwide, each surrounded by historical patterns of disappearances and strange phenomena occurring in roughly 70-year cycles. Many of these locations featured ancient stone structures reminiscent of the column we'd encountered, objects described in local folklore as seals or locks or binding stones. I compiled my findings into a comprehensive report and submitted it through official channels, expecting the bureaucratic inertia that typically greeted theoretical research. Instead, I was summoned to a secure meeting with the division director herself, a woman I'd met only once before, during my initial recruitment. "Your report has been classified beyond standard protocols," she informed me without preamble as I sat across from her desk. "The correlation between these sites and our current monitoring data is concerning." She activated a holographic display showing a global map with pulsing red dots indicating the locations I'd identified in my research. Superimposed over these were real-time waveform analyses from each site, all showing the same rhythmic pattern we'd recorded at Black Mountain, perfectly synchronized despite thousands of miles of separation. "They're communicating," I said, the realization settling like ice in my stomach. "Or resonating," the director corrected, "like tuning forks vibrating at the same frequency. We believe what happened at Black Mountain triggered a sympathetic response in these other locations. The containment structures at these sites are showing signs of degradation at an accelerating rate." She deactivated the display and fixed me with an evaluating gaze. "We're forming specialized teams to assess and reinforce these structures before they fail completely. Your experience with these entities makes you uniquely qualified to lead one such team. With all due respect, Director, my last encounter with these entities resulted in the loss of my team leader and the compromise of an entire geographic region." "Which is precisely why you won't underestimate them again," she countered. "We need field agents who understand what we're facing, who have seen it firsthand, and still maintained enough psychological stability to function." I considered declining, using my pending retirement as an excuse. But the images from that night in the forest haunted me still. Mason's transformation, the tear in the sky, the sense of ancient patience finally rewarded. If similar events were poised to occur globally, retirement would offer no sanctuary. "I'll need to select my own team," I said finally, "and full access to all historical data on previous encounters, not just the sanitized reports." The director nodded, sliding a secure tablet across the desk. "You'll find dossiers on recommended personnel. Your authorization level has been upgraded to access all relevant historical files, including those predating the division's formation." As I left her office, tablet in hand, I felt a weight settling onto my shoulders. The responsibility not just for my future team, but for the barriers between our world and whatever existed beyond them. I understood now why the division had sent us to Black Mountain despite the historical failures. Some threats cannot be ignored, only confronted, even when victory seems impossible. That night, in my Spartan Division apartment, I reviewed the personnel files, searching for individuals with the unique combination of skills and psychological resilience necessary for our task. Sarah's name appeared among the candidates, her technological expertise noted as essential for the monitoring systems we would need to establish. Logan was conspicuously absent, his post-Black Mountain evaluation having revealed deeper trauma than he had initially displayed. As I worked, I found myself occasionally glancing at the shadows in the corners of my room, half expecting them to deepen and shift. The entities had changed something fundamental in my perception, or perhaps had merely revealed what had always been there, just beyond the edge of human awareness. I still dream of Mason sometimes, not as the twisted thing he became at the end, but as he was during our years working together. In these dreams, he stands at the edge of a great darkness, neither advancing nor retreating, but maintaining a vigilant watch. Perhaps it's my mind's way of processing loss, or perhaps something of him remains intact, even in whatever form he now exists. The Black Mountain incident officially remains a containment failure in Division records, but I've come to see it differently. We didn't fail to contain the entity. We simply discovered that containment was always a temporary measure against something that operates on a timescale beyond human comprehension. The column in Devil's Hollow had stood for centuries, perhaps millennia, maintaining a barrier that was always destined to weaken. Our new mission isn't to defeat these entities, that may be impossible given their nature, but to understand the ancient methods that kept them at bay for generations and adapt those techniques with modern technology. It's a holding action, buying time for humanity to prepare for a reality where the boundaries between dimensions are more permeable than we ever imagined. Tomorrow, I begin assembling my team. We'll start with the site in northern Finland where local authorities have reported increasing seismic activity and unexplained disappearances near a prehistoric stone arrangement deep within the Arctic Circle. The pattern matches Black Mountain too closely to ignore, and satellite imagery shows the characteristic circular depression beginning to form. I've requested Division Archives send all available information on the region's folklore, particularly stories involving thin places or entities that move between worlds. I've also requisitioned specialized equipment based on Sarah's designs, improved versions of the pulse disruptor that temporarily affected the entities at Black Mountain. As I prepare for this next mission, I carry the weight of what I know, that beneath the orderly surface of our reality, there exists a vast network of hollow spaces where something ancient and patient waits. The seals that kept them contained are failing simultaneously across the globe, and the Division, for all its resources and knowledge, is merely buying time against an inevitable emergence. Yet I continue because someone must stand at the edge of that darkness. Someone must remember Mason's sacrifice and the lessons of Black Mountain. Someone must carry the torch of human resistance against forces that existed before humanity drew its first breath and will likely remain long after our species is dust. My name is Ulysses Mercer. I work for a covert division under the U.S. government, tasked with investigating and neutralizing cryptid threats. But more than that, I am a sentinel at the boundary between worlds, bearing witness to the shadows that grow deeper with each passing day, preparing for the moment when the hollow places beneath our feet can no longer be ignored. The division calls us hollow hunters, but the truth is far more complex. We aren't the hunters. We're just the first line of defense in a war most of humanity doesn't even know is coming. I suppose I should start with some background. This all happened in early 2019, when I was still trying to make sense of a loss that left a void in my life. My friend Julia was found dead 2 years prior in a Walgreens parking lot. She was slumped over in her car with no visible injuries, and the case was quickly ruled as a suicide by drug overdose. I never believed this conclusion. Julia radiated warmth. She was the kind of person you'd see and couldn't help but smile. Her presence brightened any room she entered, and her laugh was infectious. She volunteered at the local animal shelter every weekend. She organized community cleanups. She was planning to start a nonprofit focused on environmental conservation. This was not someone who would turn to drugs, and certainly not someone who would take her own life. The investigation felt hasty and superficial. When I arrived at the scene that night, the officers kept me at a distance. "Standard procedure," Officer Wilson told me, his face expressionless under the harsh parking lot lights. "We need to preserve the integrity of the scene." But I caught glimpses that didn't add up. No visible medication bottles, no signs of distress in her expression. She looked peaceful, almost as if she were sleeping. The medical examiner, Dr. Bennett, signed off on the overdose ruling within 48 hours. When I requested the toxicology report, I was met with bureaucratic obstacles. These things take time, I was told repeatedly, until eventually I stopped asking. Julia and I had spoken just hours before she died. She sounded excited, not despondent. I found something, she had said, her voice hushed yet energetic over the phone. Meet me tomorrow. I need to show you in person. But tomorrow never came for her. I spent months searching for answers, questioning friends, colleagues, anyone who might know something. Most people accepted the official story and moved on. Some suggested I should do the same. Grief can make us see conspiracies where there are none, my mother said gently. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was fabricating mysteries to avoid accepting that Julia was gone. Eventually, I stopped actively investigating, but I never stopped wondering. I was taking a walk through a wooded area near my property earlier this morning in April 2019. The sun had just crested the horizon, bathing the forest in a soft golden light. The air was crisp with morning dew, and birds called to each other from the branches above. I walked this path often. It helped clear my mind when memories of Julia became overwhelming. The morning progressed normally until approximately 8 a.m. when something shifted. The birds stopped their cheerful chorus mid-note. The squirrels that had been scampering through the underbrush froze in place before quietly retreating up the nearest trees. Even the wind seemed to pause, leaving the forest in an unnatural stillness. The silence pressed against my eardrums, making me acutely aware of my own breathing, which suddenly sounded thunderous. I slowed my pace, scanning the surrounding trees. Had a predator entered the area? A bear, perhaps, or a mountain lion? The forest felt different, not just quiet, but watchful. The hairs on my arms stood on end despite the mild temperature. When I turned back to the path ahead, I saw it. A fox standing motionless in the middle of the trail. Its russet fur seemed unusually vivid against the browns and greens of the forest floor. It stared at me with an intensity that felt distinctly unnatural. Animals typically display fear or curiosity when encountering humans, but this fox's gaze held something I could only describe as recognition. It tilted its head, studying me. I blinked, and in that fraction of a second, everything changed. The fox was gone. In its place, approximately 15 meters down the trail, stood Julia. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. Julia, unmistakably Julia, stood before me in the same outfit she had worn the last time I saw her alive. A white blouse and blue jeans, her brunette hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Her lips curved into the gentle smile I had missed for 2 years. "Julia?" I called out, my voice breaking. My mind raced with impossible explanations. A twin sister I didn't know about? A look-alike? A hallucination born from grief? She raised her hand and waved, the gesture so achingly familiar that my doubts momentarily vanished. I broke into a run, calling her name again. She turned and darted into the dense underbrush to the right of the trail. I followed without hesitation, pushing through thorny brambles that scratched at my skin. Branches whipped against my face as I pursued her fleeting form through the trees. "Julia, wait," I called repeatedly. But she maintained her distance, always visible but unreachable. The terrain became steeper, but I barely noticed, focused entirely on not losing sight of her. My lungs burned with exertion, and sweat dripped into my eyes, but I pressed on. Then suddenly, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I nearly pitched forward into emptiness before catching myself. I stood at the edge of a steep cliff, a 30-meter drop into a small valley below. Of Julia, there was no sign. I called her name until my voice grew hoarse, but received no response. As I stood there, trembling from adrenaline and confusion, the sounds of the forest gradually returned, birds resuming their songs, leaves rustling in the breeze. The world righted itself as if nothing unusual had occurred. I backed away from the cliff edge, my mind racing. What had I just experienced? Was Julia trying to communicate something? Was this a warning? Or was my grief finally manifesting in dangerous ways? The walk back home took twice as long as normal. My legs felt leaden, and I repeatedly stopped to look over my shoulder, half expecting to see Julia, or the fox, watching me from between the trees. The forest had returned to normal, but I had not. When I finally reached my cabin, I collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table and placed my shaking hands flat against the worn wood. I needed to think rationally. People don't transform from animals. The dead don't return to life. There had to be a logical explanation. Exhaustion, stress, grief, all potential culprits for hallucinations. But what I had seen felt too vivid, too detailed to be a mere product of my imagination. I remembered the specific way Julia's hair had caught the light, the slight scuff mark on the left toe of her shoe, details I hadn't consciously remembered in years. I reached for my phone and hesitated. Who could I possibly call? What would I say? I just saw my dead friend transform from a fox in the woods. That would certainly convince people I'd lost my grip on reality. Instead, I booted up my laptop and began researching. Grief hallucinations were apparently not uncommon, but typically involved sensing the deceased's presence or briefly glimpsing them in familiar settings, not elaborate chase sequences through forests. I found nothing scientifically credible about foxes transforming into people. Living near Navajo reservations, I had heard scattered references to skinwalkers, shapeshifters from Native American legends. But embracing such explanations felt like abandoning reason altogether. Besides, Julia had been kind and loving. The concept of her spirit becoming something malevolent that would lure me toward a deadly fall seemed fundamentally wrong. As evening approached, I found myself continuously glancing toward the windows, watching the forest darken. Sleep felt impossible. I made a pot of coffee and settled in for a long night, pulling out my old files on Julia's death. I spread the newspaper clippings, notes from my conversations with witnesses, and the few official documents I'd managed to obtain across the table. Looking at them with fresh eyes, certain inconsistencies seemed to stand out more sharply than before. The official time of death had been estimated between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m., but the security guard at the Walgreens had reported finding her at 11:30 p.m. The same guard mentioned seeing another car leave the far end of the parking lot when he approached Julia's vehicle, a detail absent from the police report. Most significantly, Julia's phone had never been recovered. The police claimed it wasn't in her car or on her person. Where had it gone? And what about the something she'd found? The reason she'd called me the day she died? As I reviewed these details, a new possibility formed in my mind. What if Julia's death wasn't a suicide at all? What if someone had wanted to silence her? And what if today's experience, however impossible it seemed, was somehow connected? The next morning arrived with gray skies and a persistent drizzle. I hadn't slept, and my eyes burned from exhaustion. The rational part of my brain urged me to dismiss yesterday's experience as a stress-induced hallucination. But a deeper instinct kept pulling me back to the forest. I dressed in waterproof layers, packed a small bag with water, protein bars, a first aid kit, and a powerful flashlight, and set out toward the woods again. This time, I brought a digital camera. The forest felt different in the rain, subdued and secretive. Droplets collected on leaves before falling in heavy splashes to the forest floor. My boots sank slightly into the softened earth with each step. I followed the same path as yesterday, alert for any unusual silence or animal behavior. Nothing out of the ordinary occurred until I reached the approximate spot where I'd first seen the fox. I stopped, turning in a slow circle, camera ready. The forest continued its rain-muted symphony around me. After several minutes of waiting, I continued toward the cliff. The area looked different in the daylight, less mysterious but more ominous. Standing safely back from the edge, I surveyed the valley below. It appeared uninhabited. No buildings, no paths, just more trees clustering around a small stream that wound through the center. Nothing to indicate why Julia, or my hallucination of her, would lead me here. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A splash of white against the brown earth near the cliff edge. Carefully approaching, I discovered a small, weather-beaten plastic card partially buried in the soil. I dug it out with my fingers. It was an employee ID card for Northland Research Laboratories. The photo and name had been damaged by exposure to the elements, but the company logo remained clear. I pocketed the card, a chill running through me that had nothing to do with the rain. Northland Research Laboratories. Julia had worked there as an environmental compliance specialist for 3 years before her death. She had quit abruptly 2 months before she died, offering no explanation beyond ethical differences with management. The rain intensified as I made my way back home, thoughts churning. Was this a coincidence? Had Julia actually been here? Or had someone else from her former workplace visited this remote spot? Back at my cabin, I dried off and examined the ID card more carefully. Despite the damage, I could make out portions of the name. Bert Kinn. The photo showed a middle-aged man with glasses and a stern expression. I opened my laptop and searched for Northland Research Laboratories. Their website described them as a leader in agricultural biotechnology and environmental solutions. Nothing immediately suspicious, but Julia's ethical differences and subsequent death now felt potentially connected. The company's About Us page listed their executive team. The director of research was identified as Robert Kincaid, Ph.D. I found his photo, the same man from the weathered ID card. I spent the next several hours researching Northland and Robert Kincaid. The company had received several EPA citations for improper chemical disposal 5 years ago, but had apparently cleaned up its act since then. Kincaid had published extensively on agricultural pest control methods, focusing on developing chemicals that targeted specific insect species without harming beneficial ones. What caught my attention was a small news item from 3 months before Julia's death. Northland had purchased 500 acres of land in the county for advanced field testing. The rough location described matched the valley below the cliff. As night fell, the rational explanation I'd been seeking began to take shape, but it provided little comfort. If Julia had discovered something concerning about Northland's research or their use of that valley, and if she had evidence on her phone. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted my thoughts. Headlights swept across my living room wall as a vehicle pulled up outside my cabin. I wasn't expecting visitors, especially not at this hour and in this remote location. Moving to the window, I peered through a gap in the curtains. A dark SUV with tinted windows had parked in my driveway. 2 men in dark raincoats emerged, their faces obscured in the darkness. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched the men approach my front door. They moved with purpose, their postures suggesting authority or at least confidence. I quickly turned off the lights in the living room and retreated to the kitchen, grabbing my phone. The sharp knock when it came still made me jump. I remained silent, debating my options. My cabin was isolated. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away. Calling the police would mean a minimum 20-minute wait for response. "We know you're home," a voice called through the door. "We just want to talk." I remained silent, my back pressed against the kitchen wall. "It's about Julia Monroe," the voice continued. "And what you found today?" That decided it. I couldn't call the police, not yet. These men knew about Julia, and possibly about the ID card. I needed information more than I needed protection. "I'm armed," I lied, approaching the door. "Identify yourselves." "My name is Michael Wayland," the voice replied. "This is my colleague, Vincent Morris. We're from Northland Research Laboratories Security Division. We're not armed, and we're not here to threaten you." I opened the door a few inches, keeping the chain engaged. 2 men stood on my porch, one tall and lean with graying hair, the other younger with a build that suggested regular gym visits. "How did you know I found something today?" I asked. The older man, Michael, exchanged a glance with his colleague. "We have security cameras throughout the valley. It's private property. We saw you at the cliff and noticed you picked something up. That doesn't explain how you found my address. Your property borders company land. We have records of all adjacent landowners." His explanation was smooth, rehearsed. "What do you want?" "May we come in? The rain is getting worse." I hesitated, then closed the door, unhooked the chain, and reopened it. "Make it quick." They entered, removing their wet coats and hanging them by the door. Their clothes underneath were business casual, nothing indicating they were official security. "We believe you found an ID card belonging to Dr. Kincaid," Michael said, taking a seat at my kitchen table without waiting for an invitation. "It's company property, and we'd like it returned." "Why was it at the edge of a cliff on your private property?" I countered. "Dr. Kincaid frequently hikes through the area while inspecting our field research," Vincent replied. "He must have dropped it during one of his inspections. And the cameras that spotted me, they were installed when? Before or after Julia died?" The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. Michael's expression hardened. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but Julia Monroe's death was thoroughly investigated and ruled a suicide. It had nothing to do with Northland." "Then you won't mind if I keep asking questions," I said, pulling out the chair opposite him and sitting down. Julia called me the day she died. She said she'd found something she needed to show me. Her phone was never recovered. People in distress often make cryptic statements, Michael said, his tone softening to something almost patronizing. I understand she was your friend, and it's natural to look for explanations beyond the official one. But sometimes, tragically, people hide their suffering well. Julia wasn't suffering, I insisted, and she wouldn't have killed herself. Vincent leaned forward. The ID card, please, then we'll leave you alone. Something in his tone, a subtle threat beneath the politeness, made my decision for me. I don't have it here. I put it somewhere safe after I found it. The two men exchanged another look. Where exactly? Michael asked. That's my insurance, I replied. Now I'd like you both to leave. It's late, and I'm tired. Michael stood, his friendly facade dropping completely. You're making a mistake. Northland is a respected company with significant resources. We protect our interests. Is that what happened to Julia? She threatened your interests? Vincent stepped closer, his size suddenly intimidating in my small kitchen. We had nothing to do with what happened to your friend, but continuing to make unfounded accusations could create legal problems for you. Defamation, trespassing, theft of company property. I stood my ground. I think the police would be interested in why Northland Security is threatening a private citizen at night. After a tense moment, Michael nodded to Vincent. We'll go. But this conversation isn't over. He reached into his pocket and placed a business card on the table. When you're ready to be reasonable, call me directly. They collected their coats and left. I locked the door behind them and watched through the window as their SUV backed out of my driveway and disappeared down the road. My hands were shaking as I picked up Michael's card. Beneath his name and title, Director of Corporate Security, was a direct phone number. I knew I wouldn't be sleeping tonight either. Grabbing my laptop, I began a new search. Northland Research Laboratories, plus Robert Kincaid, plus experimental testing, plus Valley. The search yielded little initially, mostly press releases about Northland's commitment to environmental stewardship and sustainable agriculture. But on the third page of results, I found a link to an environmental watchdog blog. The post, dated 3 weeks before Julia's death, mentioned rumors of unauthorized chemical testing in watershed areas by a major agricultural research company. The post didn't name Northland specifically, likely for legal reasons, but mentioned the company had recently acquired land in our county. The blogger, someone named EcoWhistle, claimed to have a source inside the company who had documented evidence of soil and water contamination from experimental pesticides. Could Julia have been this source? I dug deeper, searching for other posts by EcoWhistle. There were several, each containing more detailed allegations about improper chemical disposal and potential health risks to local wildlife and water supplies. The final post was dated 2 days after Julia's death. It simply read, "With profound sadness, I must inform readers that my source has unexpectedly passed away. Without their evidence, I cannot continue these reports. This will be my final post on this matter." My exhaustion vanished, replaced by a rush of adrenaline. This couldn't be coincidence. Julia must have been gathering evidence against Northland, evidence that died with her, or more accurately, evidence that disappeared when her phone did. But what about today's experience in the forest? The fox, Julia's appearance, these still defied rational explanation. Unless it wasn't Julia I saw at all. A new disturbing possibility formed in my mind. What if someone had been monitoring my activities since Julia's death, aware of my suspicions? What if today's apparition had been staged, someone resembling Julia, meant to lure me to the cliff edge? The timing of Northland Security arriving at my home mere hours after I found the ID card suggested surveillance more sophisticated than just cameras in the valley. I checked all my windows and doors, ensuring they were locked. Then I gathered what I needed: my laptop, the ID card, a small overnight bag with essentials, and my car keys. I couldn't stay here tonight. Before leaving, I took one additional precaution. I typed up everything I had discovered, along with my suspicions, and scheduled an email to be sent to several news outlets and law enforcement agencies tomorrow morning if I didn't cancel it. Then I slipped out to my car and drove to a motel in the neighboring town. The motel was basic but clean, and most importantly, anonymous. I paid cash for one night and settled into the room, placing a chair against the door handle for additional security. With my laptop, I continued investigating until my eyes refused to stay open. Robert Kincaid's research history revealed a pattern, promising early results followed by projects mysteriously abandoned before peer review. Northland had been sued twice by former employees for wrongful termination, but both cases had been settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. I finally dozed off around 4 a.m., my dreams filled with foxes that spoke with Julia's voice and cliffs that crumbled beneath my feet. Morning came too soon, sunlight streaming through gaps in the cheap curtains. I checked my phone. No missed calls or messages. The visit from Northland's security team apparently hadn't been followed by further contact. After a quick shower and coffee from the motel's lobby, I made a decision. I needed to see the valley from below. If Northland was conducting experiments there that threatened the environment, there might be physical evidence, containers, equipment, chemical traces that could corroborate my suspicions. Rather than returning to the cliff, I consulted online maps to find an access point to the valley that wouldn't require crossing Northland property. There appeared to be an old logging road that approached from the opposite direction, likely unused for years but potentially navigable with my SUV. The logging road was in worse condition than I'd anticipated. My vehicle bounced and scraped along the overgrown path, fallen branches scratching against the sides. After about 2 miles, the road became impassable, forcing me to continue on foot. The forest here felt different from the areas I usually hiked, denser, less traveled, with an unsettling stillness that reminded me of yesterday's experience. I checked my phone periodically, dropping pins on my location in case I needed to find my way back quickly. After 40 minutes of hiking, the trees began to thin, and I caught glimpses of open space ahead. I slowed my pace, moving more cautiously now. If Northland had security cameras throughout the area, I needed to remain undetected. I reached the edge of the forest and crouched behind a large fallen trunk. Before me stretched the valley I had viewed from above yesterday. From this vantage point, I could see what had been invisible from the cliff. A collection of small, prefabricated buildings clustered near the stream, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Signs warning private property and no trespassing were posted at regular intervals. Through my camera's zoom lens, I could make out more details. The largest building appeared to be a field laboratory, with smaller structures that might be storage or equipment sheds. A dirt road led from the compound to somewhere beyond my line of sight, presumably connecting to a main road outside the valley. What caught my attention most, however, were the patches of discolored vegetation surrounding the facility. In several areas, the normally vibrant spring growth was stunted and yellowed in perfect circular patterns. These weren't natural formations. They looked like test plots. I took numerous photos, documenting the facility, the fence, and especially the damaged vegetation. As I adjusted my position to capture a better angle, my foot dislodged a rock that clattered down the slight incline toward the valley floor. A moment later, the door to the main building opened. A figure emerged, a man in a white lab coat. Even from this distance, I recognized him from his photo. Robert Kincaid. He scanned the tree line in my direction. I froze, pressing myself against the ground behind the fallen tree. After a moment, he retreated inside. But my brief sense of relief was shattered when an alarm began to sound from the facility. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Gathering my belongings, I began making my way back through the forest as quickly and quietly as possible. The sound of an engine starting behind me accelerated my pace to a run. I had covered perhaps half the distance back to my vehicle when I heard voices calling to each other through the trees. They were searching for me, and they were closing in. My foot caught on an exposed root, sending me tumbling down a small embankment. Pain shot through my ankle as I attempted to stand. Not broken, I thought, but definitely sprained. I couldn't outrun them now. Limping to a dense thicket, I concealed myself as best I could and pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I was too deep in the forest. But my camera still contained the evidence I'd gathered. I removed its memory card and tucked it into my sock, then placed the camera in an obvious location a few yards from my hiding place. With luck, they'd find it and assume I dropped it while fleeing. The voices grew closer. I controlled my breathing, trying to remain silent despite the throbbing in my ankle. Through gaps in the foliage, I caught glimpses of figures moving through the trees, at least 3 men, one of whom I recognized as Vincent from last night. They found the camera quickly. "Got something," one called out. Vincent examined it, then spoke into a radio. Found a camera, checking for ID. He opened the compartment, finding it empty of identification and, more importantly, the memory card. Keep searching, he ordered. They can't have gone far. For over an hour, I remained motionless in my hiding place as the search continued around me. Eventually, the voices receded as the search pattern moved farther away. When I felt reasonably certain they were gone, I began the painful process of making my way back to my vehicle, keeping to the densest parts of the forest and moving as quietly as possible despite my injury. By the time I reached my SUV, the sun was beginning to set. I started the engine and carefully navigated back to the main road, constantly checking my rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. I didn't return to my cabin. Instead, I drove straight to the county sheriff's office in the neighboring town, where I requested to speak with Sheriff Rebecca Lynn, whom I knew by reputation to be thorough and honest. Sheriff Lynn listened to my story without interruption, her expression remaining neutral as I recounted everything, from Julia's death to my experience in the forest, the visit from Northland Security, and my discovery at the Valley facility. When I mentioned Julia's name, I noticed a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "I remember that case," she said when I finished. "It wasn't in my jurisdiction. It happened in Riverside County. But I knew the investigating officers." "They ruled it a suicide too quickly," I said. "They missed connections." She nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps, or perhaps they were encouraged to miss them." She leaned forward. "You mentioned you have photographs?" I retrieved the memory card from my sock and handed it to her. She inserted it into her computer and began reviewing the images, her face growing increasingly serious. "These circular patterns," she said, pointing to the discolored vegetation. "They're consistent with chemical testing, and this facility doesn't appear in any of our permit records." She looked up at me. "This is concerning, but it's not proof of murder." But combined with Julia's final phone call to me, her missing phone, and Northland's aggressive response to my questions. "It's circumstantial," she interrupted, "but it's enough to warrant further investigation." She removed the memory card and placed it in an evidence envelope. "I'm going to contact the State Environmental Protection Agency and request an emergency inspection of that facility. In the meantime, you're not safe at your cabin." She arranged for me to stay at a local bed and breakfast under a different name, with a deputy posted nearby for protection. "Don't contact anyone," she instructed. "Don't use social media, and don't return to your property until I tell you it's safe." The next 3 days passed in a blur of anxiety and impatience. I received updates from Sheriff Lynn twice daily, brief, cautious calls that revealed little. On the 4th day, she arrived at the bed and breakfast in person, her expression serious but satisfied. "We executed a search warrant on the Northland facility yesterday," she said once we were seated privately. "What we found confirms your suspicions. They were testing an experimental pesticide that failed EPA safety reviews last year. The chemical composition matches trace evidence found in Julia's system during her autopsy." "They poisoned her," I whispered, the confirmation both vindicating and devastating. Sheriff Lynn nodded. "It appears so. The toxicology report identified the substance as a common anti-anxiety medication, which is why it was ruled a suicide. But this pesticide breaks down into compounds that mimic those medications. It was designed to be undetectable." "And her phone?" "Still missing. But we've arrested Robert Kincaid and Michael Wayland. They're facing multiple charges, including environmental violations, corporate fraud, and now, murder." "What about what I saw in the forest?" "Julia, or someone who looked like her." Sheriff Lynn's expression softened. "That remains unexplained. We found no evidence of anyone impersonating your friend. The security cameras at the facility didn't show anyone besides you in that area on the day in question." I felt a chill. "So what did I see?" "I can't answer that," she said gently. "Sometimes in moments of stress or revelation, our minds process information in unusual ways. Perhaps some part of you already knew the truth about Julia, and your subconscious found a way to lead you to it." I wasn't entirely satisfied with this explanation, but I had no better one to offer. The fox, Julia's appearance, these remained mysteries that perhaps would never be solved. In the weeks that followed, the case against Northland executives built steadily. Internal documents revealed that Julia had indeed discovered their illegal testing and had collected water and soil samples as evidence. She had threatened to expose them unless they ceased operations and properly cleaned up the contamination. Rather than comply, they had silenced her permanently. The Valley facility was shut down. Environmental specialists began the long process of decontaminating the area. Northland Research Laboratories filed for bankruptcy amid the scandal and multiple lawsuits. I eventually returned to my cabin, though the forest no longer felt like the peaceful retreat it once had been. I never again saw the fox or Julia's apparition, despite many walks along the same trails. Sometimes I find myself standing at the cliff edge, looking down at the valley, wondering if Julia somehow found a way to guide me toward the truth. Science offers no explanation for such things, yet the timing and circumstances defy mere coincidence. Perhaps some mysteries are better left unsolved. What matters is that Julia received justice, and the truth about her death finally came to light. Whatever, or whoever, I saw that day in the forest, I remain grateful for the encounter that set these revelations in motion. The echo in the woods has faded, but its message was heard. It was a warm summer day in June 2019 when my dad suggested we go fishing at a new spot along the river. I was 10 years old at the time and always looked forward to our fishing trips, even though I wasn't particularly skilled or interested in the actual fishing. I just enjoyed being outdoors and spending time with my dad. We arrived at the riverbank, and I was immediately struck by how different this location was from our usual tranquil ponds. The river surged past, churning with a powerful current that sent a light spray into the air. Dad seemed unfazed as he confidently cast his line into the turbulent waters. After watching him for a bit, restlessness overtook me, and I wandered over to the rocky shore. The stones were slick with river spray as I clambered over them, my 10-year-old imagination dreaming up adventures. In my mind, I transformed into a fearless explorer, leaping nimbly from rock to rock. That's when I first noticed the man standing downstream. He wore old-fashioned fishing attire that seemed like it belonged in a vintage photograph. Garbed in waders, a faded plaid flannel shirt, and a weathered canvas hat, he stood completely still, facing the rushing current. I found it odd that he was positioned several yards behind my dad, yet neither of them acknowledged each other. My father was usually so friendly, eager to strike up a conversation with anyone. But he continued fishing, seemingly oblivious to the stranger's presence. As if sensing my gaze, the man by the river suddenly turned in my direction. With a solemn expression, he gestured for me to come over to where he stood at the water's edge. I hesitated briefly, but seeing as he was only a short distance from my dad, I figured it was safe to approach. The man crouched down as I drew near, bringing his face level with mine. What I saw in his eyes made my breath catch in my throat. They were filled with a profound, almost tangible sadness. The kind of melancholy that spoke of tragedies I couldn't begin to fathom at my young age. Those haunted eyes bore into mine with startling intensity. In a grave whisper, he cautioned, "You mustn't play so close to the river, child. The rocks are treacherous and the current unforgiving. It would pull you under in an instant, stealing the breath from your lungs. Steer clear of the water's edge." A shiver ran through me despite the warm day. Something about his words, spoken with such heavy sorrow, unnerved me deeply. I mutely nodded my agreement to stay away from the rocks and hurried to find a patch of wildflowers to pick instead, putting some distance between myself and the unsettling stranger. When my dad came looking for me later, puzzled by my change in activity, I recounted my interaction with the grim-faced fisherman. Dad's forehead creased in bewilderment as he scanned the area. "I don't see any other fishermen around, honey. Are you sure you didn't imagine it? We've been the only ones out here all day." I insisted that the man had been there, that we had spoken, but my father just shook his head as he pointed out our lone vehicle in the empty parking lot. An inexplicable tenseness had settled over him. He hastily gathered up our gear, mumbling that it was best we cut our trip short and head to the donut shop instead. As we pulled out onto the road, I twisted in my seat, peering out the rear window at the receding riverbank. The mysterious stranger was nowhere to be seen. I could almost convince myself I had imagined the whole exchange. Almost, but not quite. For even at 10 years old, I knew the biting chill that had seeped into my bones as those desolate eyes met mine was no figment of a childish imagination. It would haunt me in the years to come, that inscrutable gaze heavy with unspoken tragedy. And though I couldn't grasp it then, a disquieting certainty grew in me that our paths had crossed for a reason. The man by the river lingered at the edges of my thoughts in the days following our aborted fishing trip. I replayed our encounter repeatedly in my mind. The way he seemed to materialize out of nowhere, the weight of his words, the intensity of his sorrow. It felt too real, too visceral to be a mere trick of the mind. Though I was young, I had an inkling that I had brushed up against something beyond the ordinary realm of my experience. A ghost? A guardian spirit? I couldn't say for certain. All I knew was that his presence had been as tangible as the clammy rocks beneath my feet that day. At night, I'd startle awake, heart pounding, the stranger's mournful eyes boring into me from the shadows. In the light of day, I tried my best to push the unsettling memory to the back of my mind. But it was always there, an itch I couldn't quite scratch. As the summer wore on, I found myself increasingly drawn to the river, despite my dad's reluctance to return. I would beg and plead until he finally relented, though never to the same spot. We'd set up further downstream or pick a different bend in the waterway. Each time I'd scan the banks, half fearful, half hopeful that I might catch a glimpse of the spectral fisherman again. But he never reappeared. The river flowed on, indifferent to the secrets it carried in its murky depths. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there somewhere, keeping his silent vigil. Watching. Waiting. A melancholic sentinel bound to the raging waters that had no doubt carved out the lines of tragedy etched upon his face. As the years passed and I grew older, the memory of that fateful June day began to fade like an old photograph. Edges worn soft, details blurred by time. I came to doubt myself, to wonder as my dad had if it had simply been a flight of childhood fancy. A lonely ghost conjured up by an overactive imagination. But every so often, I'd find myself back at the river's edge, drawn by a pull I couldn't quite define. And in the hushed whisper of the churning current, I'd swear I could almost hear his voice on the wind, a spectral echo of that long-ago warning. Even as an adult, I'd feel a shiver dance up my spine as I dipped my toes into those frothing waters. The stranger's words would come back to me then, his mournful admonition against the river's deadly embrace, and I'd hastily scramble back to shore, pulse thrumming in my veins. For deep down, in a place untouched by logic or the passage of time, I knew the truth of what I had seen that day. Knew it in my bones with the same unshakable certainty that had gripped me as a child staring into those fathomless, haunted eyes. The river kept its secrets, and somewhere out there, a lost soul kept watch. Two mysteries inextricably intertwined, bound together by currents far deeper and more powerful than the turbulent waters that separated them. And though I had no way of knowing the stranger's story, the depths of tragedy that anchored him to that lonely spot, I carried a piece of it with me always. A splinter of someone else's sorrow lodged in my heart. Unshakable, unforgettable. The ghost by the river, forever watching. And me, the girl who couldn't look away, forever bound to the memory. A shared haunting that spanned the gulf between the living and the dead. As I entered my teenage years, I found myself increasingly consumed by the mystery of the spectral fisherman. The memory of our encounter had calcified into something solid and unignorable inside me, a kernel of the inexplicable that I couldn't simply disregard as childish fancy. I began to spend hours at the local library, combing through old newspapers and historical records, searching for any scrap of information that might shed light on the stranger's identity. I pored over grainy, black and white photos of the town's early settlers, hoping to spot a familiar face among the stern, sepia-toned visages. But the man by the river remained as elusive in the annals of history as he had been in life, or rather death. Frustrated by the lack of concrete leads, I turned to the internet, scouring paranormal forums and message boards for stories similar to mine. And while I found plenty of tales of ghostly encounters and restless spirits, none quite matched the specifics of what I had experienced that June day. Still, I couldn't help but be drawn in by the accounts of others who had brushed up against the veil between worlds. People who had looked into the eyes of the dead and caught a glimpse of the great, yawning chasm of sorrow and loss that lay beyond. In their words, I found a strange sort of kinship, a validation of the bone-deep certainty that had taken root in me all those years ago. As my obsession grew, so too did my isolation. I withdrew from my friends, from the normal teenage rites of passage and preoccupations. I became a ghost myself in a way, haunting the edges of the living world, consumed by a quest for answers that always seemed to dangle just out of reach. My parents watched with growing concern as I retreated further into myself. They urged me to let go of what they saw as an unhealthy fixation, to rejoin the land of the living. But I couldn't make them understand the depth of the connection I felt to the sad-eyed shade by the river. The way his story, even unknown, had become inexorably tangled with my own. And so I persisted in my lonely pursuit, chasing threads of history and hearsay in search of some scrap of closure. Though the specter himself remained frustratingly out of reach, I began to piece together fragments of the river's dark past, whispers of tragedy and loss that seemed to cling to the water's edge like a miasma. Drownings, accidents, lives cut short by the current's merciless grasp. The more I uncovered, the more I came to understand the stranger's solemn mission. He was a sentinel, a watchman appointed by death itself to stand guard over the treacherous waters that had claimed him. A melancholy gatekeeper tasked with warning the living away from the river's fatal embrace. And though I had no proof beyond the certitude of my own youthful encounter, I knew in my marrow that his post was a penance, a price exacted for some tragedy he couldn't avert in life. An eternal duty born of drowning sorrow, forever bound to the currents that had shaped his fate. With each new fragment of knowledge, each whispered tale of lives lost to the river's churning depths, I felt the weight of the mystery settling more heavily upon my shoulders. It became a second skin I wore beneath the facade of ordinary teenage life, a secret burden that set me apart from my peers even as it consumed me from within. In the stranger's haunted eyes, I had glimpsed a sorrow beyond words, beyond comprehension. And now, with every new piece of the puzzle I uncovered, I felt myself being drawn deeper into the shadows of that grief. A threnody of loss, echoing across time, calling me further into the river's darkest reaches. The weight of the mystery I carried began to take its toll as the years slipped by. The once vibrant curiosity that had fueled my search for answers slowly calcified into something harder, sharper, an obsession that cut me off from the world of the living even as it bound me more tightly to the dead. I withdrew from my few remaining friends. My grades slipped as I lost myself in the labyrinthine threads of history and hearsay. The concerns of ordinary teenage life, crushes, social drama, college applications, all felt distant and unreal compared to the dark, inexorable pull of the river's secrets. My parents, once merely concerned, grew frightened by the change in me. I overheard them whispering in the kitchen late at night, hushed, urgent exchanges punctuated by my mother's muffled sobs. They spoke of therapy, of medication, of sending me away somewhere to get help. But I knew with grim certainty that no psychiatrist's couch or prescription could untangle the knot of obsession that had taken root in my soul. And so I learned to hide the depths of my preoccupation, to paste on a brittle smile and go through the motions of normal life. But inside, I was unraveling, coming apart at the seams as the river's dark history seeped into the marrow of my bones. I spent long, lonely hours walking along the riverbank, retracing the steps of that long-ago June day. The once lively summer spot now felt haunted, heavy with the weight of unseen presences. The water churned and hissed, black as ink, and I imagined I could feel the cold, spectral fingers of the drowned brushing against my ankles in the shallows. As my desperation grew, so too did the recklessness of my search. I began to take risks, venturing out to the river alone at night, when the inky water seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I would stand at the edge of the current, the toes of my sneakers kissing the waterline, and call out into the darkness, pleading, demanding, begging for a sign. But the river kept its secrets, and the sad-eyed shade remained stubbornly out of reach. It all came to a head one moonless night in late October, the air sharp with the first bite of winter. I had stolen out of the house in the witching hour, driven by a compulsion I could no longer ignore. The river was a black ribbon in the darkness, its surface broken only by the jagged reflection of stars. I picked my way down the rocky embankment, heart hammering against my ribs. The water seemed to reach out for me as I drew closer, tendrils of mist curling around my ankles like spectral hands. And then I was at the edge, the current lapping hungrily at my feet. "Please," I whispered into the night, my voice cracking under the strain of my desperation. "I need to know. I need to understand." For a long, breathless moment, there was nothing but the rush of the water and the high, keening cry of the wind. And then, Out of the depths of the mist, a figure began to take shape. A man, achingly familiar, his form wavering and translucent at the edges. He stood before me, those fathomless eyes boring into mine, and in their depths, I saw the answer I had been seeking all along. A tragedy, a life cut short, a restless spirit bound by guilt and grief to the scene of his own demise. In that moment, I understood with searing clarity the price of the knowledge I had so relentlessly pursued. The river's secrets were not meant for the living, and in my hunger to unravel them, I had entangled myself in a skein of sorrow beyond mortal reckoning. I stumbled back from the water's edge, suddenly terrified in a way I had never been before. The specter watched me go, his expression inscrutable, and as I fled up the embankment, I swore I could hear the echo of his long-ago warning chasing at my heels. That night marked a turning point, a reckoning with the abyss I had been skirting for so long. And though it would take years to untangle myself from the river's dark pull, I knew I had finally glimpsed the true cost of the secrets I had sought to uncover. In the stranger's haunted gaze, I had seen my own fate reflected back at me. A lifetime spent chasing ghosts, forever haunted by the siren song of tragedy. And I knew, with a certainty that echoed in the marrow of my bones, that if I didn't find a way to break free, the river would claim me too in the end. After that fateful October night, I knew I could no longer continue down the path I had been relentlessly pursuing. The river's darkness had sunk its claws deep into my psyche, threatening to drag me under the same way it had claimed the life of the spectral fisherman all those years ago. I realized, with a clarity born of sheer terror, that I had been teetering on the edge of an abyss from which there might be no return. In my single-minded obsession to unravel the mystery of the stranger's haunting, I had nearly lost myself to the very same currents of sorrow and tragedy that had ensnared him. And so, with a heavy heart and trembling hands, I made the decision to step back from the river's edge, to turn my face away from the shadows and seek out the light, no matter how feeble and flickering it might seem in comparison to the consuming intensity of my quest. It was a decision that brought me no peace, at least not at first. Walking away felt like a betrayal, a cowardly abandonment of the sad-eyed shade who had first set me on this path. In the early days of my withdrawal, I was haunted by dreams of the fisherman, his spectral form wavering at the edges of my consciousness, his eyes boring into mine with a mute accusation. I would wake in the night, drenched in icy sweat, my heart jackrabbiting against my ribs as the remnants of the dream clung to me like a second skin. In those moments, it took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to throw on my clothes and race down to the riverbank, to plunge myself into the inky depths in a desperate bid to recapture the connection I had so abruptly severed. But I held fast to my resolve, white-knuckling my way through the long, sleepless nights and the gray, listless days that followed. I threw myself into the mundane routines of my life with a forced fervor, trying to lose myself in the banal concerns of homework and household chores. It was a pale imitation of normalcy, a flimsy facade that fooled no one, least of all myself. My parents watched me with wary eyes, their relief at my apparent reprieve from the river's thrall tempered by the unspoken fear that it was only a temporary respite. And in truth, I couldn't blame them for their skepticism. I felt the pull of the river like a constant ache in my bones, a yearning that no amount of distraction or determination could fully quell. It was always there, a dark undercurrent to my thoughts, threatening to sweep me away the moment I let my guard down. But gradually, imperceptibly at first, the stranglehold of my obsession began to loosen its grip. The dreams of the fisherman grew less frequent, less vivid, until one day I realized I couldn't quite recall the exact shade of sorrow in his eyes anymore. It was a bittersweet realization, a release that came hand in hand with a sense of loss. In turning my back on the river's secrets, I felt I had lost some essential part of myself, some vital connection to a world beyond the veil of the ordinary. But as the weeks turned to months and the seasons slowly shifted, I began to understand that perhaps this loss was necessary. That in order to truly live, I had to learn to let go of the ghosts that haunted me, no matter how seductive their whispers might be. And so, with each passing day, I learned to rebuild myself, piece by fragile piece. I relearned how to find joy in the simple things, the warmth of the sun on my face, the laughter of my friends, the sweet, uncomplicated pleasure of a job well done. It was a slow, painstaking process, this reclamation of my life from the shadows. There were still moments when the call of the river would rise up like a siren song, threatening to lure me back into the depths of my obsession. But each time, I found the strength to resist, to turn my face resolutely towards the light. And gradually, the specter of the fisherman began to fade, his hold on me weakening like a knot gently unraveling. Though I knew I would carry the memory of him with me always, a strange, secret weight in the chambers of my heart, I no longer felt bound by the sorrow that had once threatened to consume me. In the end, I like to think that my decision to step back from the abyss was not just a choice for myself, but for him as well. A way of honoring the tragic mystery of his existence by living my own life to the fullest, untethered by the chains of the past. And though I never saw him again, I like to imagine that somewhere, in some liminal space between the worlds, he had found his own measure of peace. That the river's dark currents had finally released their hold on his restless spirit, allowing him to drift free into the light. It was a comforting thought, a small flicker of hope amidst the lingering shadows of all I had seen and experienced. And as I looked to the future, to a life unburdened by the weight of secrets too heavy for mortal shoulders to bear, I held fast to that flicker, nurturing it like a flame against the gathering dark. The years slipped by like water through cupped palms, and with each passing season, I felt myself moving further away from the river's darkly seductive pull. Gradually, the gut-wrenching terror of those early days of withdrawal gave way to a duller, more manageable ache, the bittersweet pang of an old wound that never quite heals, but slowly learns to bear its own weight. I finished high school in a haze of determined normalcy, my once consuming obsession with the spectral fisherman fading into a secret, shadowy corner of my psyche. To the outside world, I was just another teenage girl navigating the turbulent waters of adolescence, worrying about prom dates and college applications, not the restless ghosts of the long dead. But even as I threw myself into the mundane rituals of teenage life, I knew that some essential part of me would always belong to the river, that I would forever carry the weight of its secrets like a second heart beating alongside my own. And so, when it came time to choose a path for myself, I found myself drawn inexorably towards a field that might allow me to grapple with the strange, haunting mysteries that had so long consumed me. Not directly, but obliquely through the lens of science and reason. I enrolled in a psychology program at a university far from the river's reach, determined to understand the workings of the human mind, to plumb the depths of grief, trauma, and obsession that could bind a soul to the sight of its own demise for generations. It was a strange, bittersweet irony, using the tools of logic and empiricism to try to make sense of an experience that defied all rational explanation. But in the sterile confines of the lecture hall and the research lab, I found a measure of solace, a way to channel the restless energy of my own haunted past into something productive, even meaningful. And yet, even as I immersed myself in the world of academic rigor and scientific inquiry, I never quite shook the feeling that the river was watching me. That the sad-eyed specter of the fisherman was lurking just beyond the edges of my consciousness, a silent guardian and a grim reminder of the abyss I had so narrowly escaped. There were still nights when I would wake in a cold sweat, my dreams haunted by visions of dark water and spectral eyes. And in those moments, I would feel the old pull, the siren song of secrets left untold and mysteries left unsolved. But I had learned through bitter experience and hard-won wisdom not to heed that call, to acknowledge the shadows that clung to me like cobwebs, but not to let them consume me as they once had. And so I pressed on, pouring myself into my studies with the same single-minded intensity I had once devoted to unraveling the river's dark history. I excelled in my coursework, earning accolades and opportunities that would have seemed unimaginable to the haunted, withdrawn girl I had once been. But even as I climbed the ranks of academia, even as I built a life for myself far from the riverbank that had so long held me in its thrall, I knew that some part of me would always belong to that place, that the ghost of the fisherman would forever be a part of me, woven into the fabric of my being like a thread of shimmering silver amidst the tapestry of my life. And in a strange way, that knowledge brought me a measure of peace, a sense that even in turning my back on the river's secrets, I had not abandoned the spectral guardian who had first set me on this path, that by living my life to the fullest, by chasing knowledge and understanding with the same fervor I had once pursued the mysteries of the drowned and the damned, I was honoring his memory in the only way I knew how. It was a strange, bittersweet legacy. A life forever touched by death, forever haunted by the whispering currents of a tragedy I would never fully comprehend. But it was my legacy, my burden, and my gift, and I bore it with a solemn pride, knowing that in some small way I was keeping the fisherman's vigil. That even as I walked in the world of the living, I carried a piece of the river's dark heart with me always, a secret talisman against the gathering light. As the years flowed by like the river's ceaseless current, I found myself settling into a new rhythm of life, one shaped by the pursuit of knowledge and understanding rather than the desperate, haunted yearning of my youth. The study of the human mind became my anchor, a way to channel the restless energy that had once driven me to the brink of obsession into something productive, even healing. I threw myself into my work with a fervor that bordered on the religious, pouring countless hours into research and clinical practice. I sought out the darkest, most troubled corners of the psyche, the realms of grief, trauma, and obsession that had once threatened to consume me, and tried to shed light on their shadowy depths. It was a strange, often harrowing journey, one that brought me face to face with the very abyss I had once skirted so perilously. But now, armed with the tools of my trade and the hard-won wisdom of my own experience, I found I could navigate those treacherous waters without losing myself entirely. And yet, even as I made a name for myself in the field publishing groundbreaking papers, speaking at prestigious conferences, earning the respect and admiration of my peers, I never quite shook the feeling that I was living a double life. That beneath the polished veneer of the accomplished academic, the successful therapist, lurked the shadow of the haunted girl I had once been. It was a secret I guarded jealously, a hidden depth to my existence that I kept carefully concealed from colleagues and clients alike. After all, who would believe the esteemed Dr. Y.N., with her impeccable credentials and razor-sharp intellect, had once been so consumed by the mystery of a ghostly fisherman that she had nearly lost herself to the river's dark embrace? But even as I kept that part of myself locked away, I found that it informed my work in ways I could never quite articulate. It was there in the empathy I showed my patients, the uncanny ability I had to see beyond their presenting symptoms to the deeper wounds that festered beneath. It was there in the relentless curiosity that drove me to seek out answers to the most intractable questions of the human condition. And sometimes, in the stillness of my office after a particularly grueling session, I would catch myself staring out the window at the distant gleam of water, feeling the old tug of the river like a phantom limb. In those moments, I would allow myself to wonder, to imagine what had become of the spectral fisherman, whether he still kept his lonely vigil on the riverbank. I never went back, never dared to venture too close to the dark waters that had once held me so firmly in their thrall. But I carried the memory of that place, of him, like a talisman, a reminder of the mysteries that lurked just beyond the edges of the known world. And as the decades slipped by, as I grew older and wiser and ever more enmeshed in the world of the living, I found that the river's hold on me began to loosen. Not disappear entirely. I knew I would carry the mark of that haunted place for as long as I drew breath, but ease, like a knot gently unraveling. It was a gradual process, a slow, almost imperceptible shift. But one day I realized that I could think of the fisherman, of the dark currents that had once pulled me under, without feeling the old, sick lurch of dread in the pit of my stomach. That I could look out at the distant shimmer of water and feel not the siren call of secrets left untold, but a strange, bittersweet sense of peace. Perhaps it was the wisdom of age, the hard-earned equanimity that comes from a lifetime spent grappling with the shadows of the human heart. Or perhaps it was simply the knowledge that in some small, imperfect way, I had kept faith with the river's dark guardian. That in the work I did, the light I tried to shine into the darkest corners of the psyche, I was honoring his memory, keeping his vigil. Either way, as I entered the autumn of my life, I found myself looking back on the strange, haunted journey that had brought me to this point with a sense of gratitude. For though the road had been dark and often treacherous, it had also been shot through with a wild, fierce beauty. The beauty of secrets glimpsed and mysteries half understood. And though I knew I would never fully unravel the enigma of the fisherman, never truly comprehend the depths of sorrow and loss that had bound him to the river's banks, I also knew that in some strange, inexplicable way, his presence had shaped me. That the river's dark currents ran through my veins, a part of me as surely as the breath in my lungs and the blood in my heart. It was a strange legacy, a haunting inheritance, but one I had learned to bear with a kind of solemn grace. And as I looked out at the world through eyes tempered by time and shadowed by the memory of the abyss, I knew that I would carry that legacy with me always, a secret talisman, a reminder of the mysteries that lurked just beyond the veil. In the end, it was the river that called me home. After a lifetime spent chasing knowledge and understanding in the bright, sterile halls of academia, I found myself longing for the dark, fathomless depths that had so long haunted my dreams. It was a yearning I had thought long buried, a ghost of my younger self that I had assumed laid to rest along with so many other shadows of my troubled past. But as I entered the twilight of my years, I could no longer deny the pull of that haunted place. It was as if some deep, primal part of me knew that my journey would never be complete until I returned to the riverbank where it had all begun, until I looked once more into the eyes of the spectral fisherman and confronted the enigma that had shaped the course of my entire life. And so, on a crisp autumn morning, I found myself standing on the banks of that dark, turbulent water once again. The years had changed me, etched lines of wisdom and sorrow into my once youthful face, but the river remained as timeless and inscrutable as ever. As I stared out at the churning currents, I felt a strange sense of homecoming, a feeling that I had been away on a long, strange journey and had finally returned to the place where I truly belonged. It was a bittersweet realization, tinged with the knowledge of all I had lost and gained in the intervening years. But there was no fear in me now, no sense of the old, paralyzing dread that had once threatened to pull me under. Instead, I felt a quiet acceptance, a deep, abiding peace that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of my bones. I closed my eyes, breathing in the damp, earthy scent of the riverbank, and allowed my mind to drift back to that long-ago summer day when I had first encountered the fisherman. I could see him still, his sad, haunted eyes boring into mine, his spectral form flickering at the edges of my vision. But now, with the wisdom of a lifetime spent grappling with the shadows of the human heart, I understood him in a way I never could have as a child. I saw the tragedy that had bound him to this place, the unimaginable loss that had tethered his restless spirit to the dark waters that had claimed him. And in that moment, I knew that I had been right to walk away all those years ago, to turn my back on the abyss that had threatened to consume me and seek out the light. But I also knew that the fisherman's legacy would forever be a part of me, woven into the fabric of my being like a thread of silver amidst the tapestry of my life. As I stood there on the riverbank, the autumn breeze whispering through my hair like a ghostly caress, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of gratitude. For though the path I had walked had been dark and often treacherous, it had also been shot through with moments of startling beauty, with glimpses of mystery and wonder that had enriched my life in ways I could never fully articulate. And now, as I prepared to take my leave of this haunted place once and for all, I knew that I would carry those moments with me always, a secret talisman against the gathering dark. I had learned to live in the world of the living, to find joy and purpose amidst the shadows of my own haunted past. But I had also learned to honor the dead, to keep faith with the restless spirits that lingered at the edges of the known world. And in that strange liminal space between the realms of light and shadow, I had found a kind of peace, a sense of belonging that transcended the boundaries of life and death. And so, with a final, silent nod to the dark waters that had so long held me in their thrall, I turned my face towards the sun. I knew I would never forget the fisherman, never lose the imprint of his haunted gaze upon my soul. But I also knew that it was time to let him go, to release him to the currents of eternity and trust that he had found his own measure of peace. As I walked away from the riverbank, my footsteps carrying me back towards the world of the living, I felt a strange, fierce joy welling up within me. For though I had been marked by death, haunted by the specter of loss and tragedy, I had also been granted a rare and precious gift. I had learned to see the world through the eyes of the dead, to glimpse the mysteries that lurked just beyond the veil of mortal understanding. And in the end, that gift had been my salvation, a strange, haunting blessing that had guided me through the darkest reaches of my own soul and brought me out the other side. As I stepped out into the bright, bustling world beyond the river's reach, I knew that I would carry that blessing with me always. In the faces of my patients, in the quiet moments of introspection and self-discovery, in the tiny, inexplicable miracles that punctuated even the most ordinary of days. I had walked in the shadow of death, danced with the specters of my own darkest fears and deepest sorrows. But I had emerged from that crucible stronger, wiser, more alive than I had ever been before. And though I knew the scars of my long, strange journey would never fully fade, I wore them now with a fierce, defiant pride, a testament to all I had seen and learned and overcome. And so I walked on, into the waiting embrace of the world, my heart full of gratitude and my eyes wide open to the wonders that lurked just beyond the horizon. I had been to the edge of the abyss and back again, had known the seductive pull of secrets too dark and deep for mortal minds to fathom. But I had also known the fierce, unquenchable joy of a life fully lived, a life shot through with mystery and magic, with moments of impossible beauty and transcendent grace. And it was that joy, that wild, defiant hope, that I carried with me now, aflame against the gathering dark. I knew there would be other rivers to cross, other shadows to brave in the years to come. But I also knew that I would meet them with the same courage, the same fierce, unbending determination that had carried me through the darkest reaches of my own haunted past. For I was a child of the river, a woman shaped by the currents of loss and longing, of sorrow and secret grace. And though the waters of my life might run dark and deep, I knew now that there was always a light waiting on the other side, a glimmer of hope, of possibility, of redemption. And so, I stepped out into the waiting world, my heart full of wonder and my eyes fixed on the distant horizon. I had walked through the valley of the shadow, had known the icy touch of death and the fiery baptism of rebirth. And now, armed with the wisdom of the ages and the fierce, unshakable strength of a survivor, I was ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, to meet my destiny with open arms and a heart full of wild, unquenchable hope. The river would always be a part of me, a haunting refrain echoing through the chambers of my soul. But it no longer held dominion over me, no longer pulled me down into its dark, fathomless depths. I had learned to swim in those treacherous waters, to navigate the currents of my own heart with grace and skill and fierce, unyielding courage. And though I knew there would be other ghosts to lay to rest, other mysteries to unravel in the years to come, I also knew that I was equal to the task. For I had seen beyond the veil, had known the touch of the infinite and the ineffable. And that knowledge, that strange, haunting wisdom, would guide me through whatever lay ahead, a beacon in the darkness, a light to steer by. And so I walked on, into the bright, beckoning world, my heart full of hope and my eyes fixed on the shimmering horizon. The river had taught me the meaning of life and death, of sorrow and secret grace. And now, armed with that knowledge and the fierce, unshakable strength it had bestowed upon me, I was ready to embrace my destiny, to meet the future with courage and compassion and wild, unquenchable joy. For I was a child of the river, a woman forged in the crucible of loss and longing. And though the waters of my life might run deep and dark, I knew now that I had the strength to swim them, to emerge from their depths stronger, wiser, and more alive than ever before. And with that knowledge, that fierce, unshakable faith, I stepped out into the waiting world, ready to meet whatever lay ahead with open arms and a heart full of infinite possibility. I've always had a complicated relationship with nature. Growing up in suburban Ohio, my childhood consisted of carefully planned family picnics and occasional visits to national parks. By my late 20s, I developed a restless desire for something more authentic, experiences unburdened by the safety nets of civilization. That's why, in June 2012, I decided to embark on a solo camping trip to the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. My friends thought I was insane. "You've barely camped before, and now you want to go alone in one of the most remote parts of Appalachia?" my roommate Jared had asked, concern etched across his face. Perhaps he was right, but something inside me craved this challenge, a test of self-reliance that couldn't be satisfied by anything else. I spent weeks preparing, researching trails and survival techniques, purchasing equipment that would make me as self-sufficient as possible. I bought a high-quality tent, a weather-appropriate sleeping bag, a water filtration system, and enough dehydrated food to last a week. The preparation gave me confidence. convincing me I was ready to face whatever the forest might throw my way. The week before my departure, I obsessively checked weather forecasts. June in West Virginia typically meant warm days and cool nights, with the occasional afternoon thunderstorm. Nothing I couldn't handle. What I failed to account for was the unpredictability of weather patterns in that region, particularly the violent summer storms that can materialize with frightening speed. I remember the morning I left my apartment in Columbus. It was a Tuesday, June 26, 2012. The sunrise painted the sky in gentle strokes of orange and pink as I loaded my Honda Civic with carefully packed gear. The air was warm, promising a beautiful day ahead. As I pulled away from the curb, a sense of liberation washed over me. For the next 5 days, I would answer to no one but myself and the wilderness. The 4-hour drive to Monongahela was uneventful. I crossed into West Virginia, watching as the landscape transformed from flat farmland to the rolling emerald hills of Appalachia. Cell service became increasingly spotty, eventually disappearing altogether as I ventured deeper into the forest. This disconnection from the digital world brought an unexpected sense of relief. No emails, no phone calls, no constant stream of news and notifications. Just me and my thoughts, accompanied by the ambient sounds of nature. I arrived at the ranger station around noon, where I registered my hiking plans with a weathered park ranger named Bill. He was a man of few words, with sun-baked skin that had seen decades of mountain weather. As he stamped my permit, he glanced at the sky with narrowed eyes. "Weather's been unpredictable lately," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Watch those clouds. If they start looking dark and the wind picks up, find shelter. We get these summer storms, derecos they call them, can be nasty business." I nodded politely, but his warning barely registered. The sky above was a clear, unblemished blue. I was too eager to begin my adventure to be concerned about hypothetical weather events. How foolish that confidence would prove to be. The first day of hiking exceeded my expectations. The trail I'd chosen was challenging enough to feel rewarding, but not so difficult that it became discouraging. Dense forests of oak, maple, and hemlock trees created a natural canopy overhead, filtering sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The June heat was tempered by cool mountain breezes, making the physical exertion pleasant rather than punishing. I encountered few other hikers, just a middle-aged couple walking in the opposite direction, and a solo backpacker who nodded silently as we passed. This solitude was precisely what I had been seeking. With each mile, the tensions and anxieties of my everyday life seemed to dissolve, replaced by a primitive focus on the fundamentals: moving forward, staying hydrated, observing my surroundings. By late afternoon, I'd covered about 8 miles, which put me slightly ahead of schedule. I found a suitable clearing to make camp near a small stream, a perfect natural water source that gurgled pleasantly over smooth stones. Setting up my tent took longer than expected. The instructions made it seem deceptively simple. As the sun began its descent, I finally had my shelter erected and a small campfire crackling. That first night in the wilderness was magical. The symphony of insect sounds, the distant hooting of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. These natural melodies were infinitely more soothing than any urban lullaby. I watched embers float upward from my campfire, disappearing into the vast blackness above. The stars were innumerable, uncorrupted by light pollution, making the sky appear closer somehow, as if I could reach up and brush my fingers against the Milky Way. I slept soundly, wrapped in my sleeping bag, with only the thin fabric of my tent separating me from the wilderness. The second day brought more challenging terrain. The trail ascended steeply at times, requiring careful footing and frequent breaks. By midday, my muscles ached pleasantly from exertion. I stopped at a rocky outcropping that offered a spectacular panoramic view of the forest, stretching for miles in every direction. Mountain ridges rose and fell like frozen waves, blanketed in a sea of green that extended toward the horizon. The vastness made me feel gloriously insignificant. I continued hiking until late afternoon, covering another 7 miles before making camp in a small clearing. The routine of setting up my tent and preparing my evening meal had already become familiar, even comforting. That night, however, I noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The air felt heavier somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. In the distance, I could hear the faint rumble of thunder. Weather changes quickly in the mountains. I knew this intellectually, but hadn't yet experienced it firsthand. Still, I wasn't overly concerned. A summer rain shower would break the heat and make sleeping more comfortable. I secured my tent more thoroughly with extra stakes and turned in for the night. I awoke around 3 a.m. to the sound of raindrops pattering against the nylon roof of my tent. The gentle shower was oddly comforting, and I drifted back to sleep with a small smile on my face. I had no idea that this gentle rain was merely the prelude to something far more sinister. The morning of my third day dawned gray and somber. The rain had stopped, but thick clouds hung low in the sky, creating a claustrophobic ceiling above the forest. I prepared a simple breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, hoping the clouds would burn off as the day progressed. They didn't. As I broke camp and continued my journey, an unsettling stillness pervaded the forest. The usual chorus of birdsong was noticeably absent, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to absorb other sounds. Even my footsteps on the leaf-strewn path seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By midday, I'd covered only about 4 miles. The humidity was oppressive, causing my clothes to cling uncomfortably to my skin. I stopped by a small stream to refill my water bottles and check my map. According to my calculations, I was now deep in the heart of the forest, at least 15 miles from the nearest access road. This isolation, which had been so appealing just days earlier, now carried a different weight. I pulled out my weather radio, a precaution I'd almost left behind, and turned it on. Through bursts of static, I caught fragments of a severe weather alert. The words "Derecho," destructive winds, and immediate shelter pierced through the interference. My stomach tightened as I recalled the ranger's warning. A derecho, a widespread, long-lived windstorm associated with a band of rapidly moving thunderstorms. I'd read about them during my preparation, but had dismissed the possibility of encountering one. They were rare, after all. What were the chances? I studied my map with growing anxiety, looking for any indication of structures or natural shelters nearby. There was nothing marked within several miles of my position. My options were limited: continue forward and hope to find shelter, or attempt to retrace my steps toward the ranger station, a journey that would take at least 2 days. The decision was made for me when I felt the first powerful gust of wind. It swept through the forest with a force that bent the tops of trees, creating a rushing sound like an approaching train. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the quality of light changed, a sickly greenish hue that transformed the familiar forest into something alien and threatening. I needed to find shelter, and quickly. Abandoning my planned route, I struck out perpendicular to the trail, heading toward a ridge I'd noticed on my map. If I could get to higher ground, I might be able to spot some form of shelter, a cave, an overhang, anything that could provide protection from falling trees and debris. The forest floor became treacherous as I climbed. Loose rocks and exposed roots threatened to twist an ankle with each step. Behind me, the wind grew increasingly violent, accompanied now by a deep, continuous rumble of thunder. The trees around me swayed dangerously, their massive trunks creaking under the strain. When I reached the ridge, what I saw made my heart pound against my ribs. The western sky was nearly black, with roiling clouds advancing like an invading army. Sheets of rain obscured the distance, and intermittent flashes of lightning illuminated the turbulent mass. It was moving fast, too fast. I was about to descend the other side of the ridge when I spotted something in the valley below, a small rectangular structure partially obscured by trees. It appeared to be man-made, possibly a maintenance building or emergency shelter. It was perhaps a mile away, and reaching it would mean descending the ridge and crossing open ground as the storm approached. I had no choice. Taking a deep breath, I began to make my way down the slope as quickly as safety would allow. The descent from the ridge was treacherous. The wind had intensified to the point where I had to lean into it to maintain balance. I slipped several times on loose shale, catching myself just before potentially catastrophic falls. My hands were scraped raw, and my knees were bruised from impact, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The structure I'd spotted from the ridge remained my beacon of hope, a concrete promise of safety in an increasingly hostile environment. As I got closer, I could make out more details. It appeared to be a small, single-walled concrete pavilion, likely built for hikers or forestry workers caught in inclement weather. The first large raindrops began to fall as I entered the valley, cold, heavy droplets that stung my face and forearms. Within seconds, the gentle patter transformed into a torrential downpour that reduced visibility to mere feet. I was instantly drenched, my clothes becoming heavy and restricting. Lightning split the sky directly overhead, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that I felt in my bones. The hair on my arms stood on end, and I knew with terrifying certainty that I was dangerously exposed. The pavilion was still several hundred yards away. A nearby pine tree exploded in a shower of splinters as lightning struck its crown. The concussive force knocked me to my knees, temporarily deafening me. The acrid smell of ozone and burning wood filled my nostrils as I struggled back to my feet. The wind was now strong enough to bend saplings nearly to the ground. It carried debris branches, leaves, and even small rocks that peppered my skin like buckshot. I shielded my face with one arm while using the other to maintain my balance against the gale. Through squinted eyes, stinging from rain, I could see that I was getting closer to the shelter. 50 yards, 40, 30. The relief I felt at this diminishing distance was tempered by the increasing fury of the storm. The wind had now reached a sustained howl that drowned out even the thunder, creating a continuous roar that pressed against my eardrums. 20 yards from the shelter, I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice, the distinct crack of wood splintering under tremendous pressure. I turned just in time to see a massive oak tree, its root system partially exposed by the saturated soil, begin its deadly descent directly in my path. Time seemed to slow. The tree fell with a terrible grace, its branches reaching out like grasping fingers. I threw myself sideways, landing hard on my shoulder as the oak crashed to the forest floor with an impact I could feel through the ground. Had I been 2 seconds slower, I would have been crushed beneath tons of wood and foliage. Shaking and gasping for breath, I scrambled to my feet and made the final dash to the concrete shelter. The relief of reaching its protection was immediate and profound. The simple structure consisted of 3 concrete walls and a flat roof, open on one side. It wasn't perfect. Rain still blew in through the open face, but it provided critical protection from the most dangerous elements of the storm. I collapsed onto the concrete floor, chest heaving, limbs trembling from exertion and fading adrenaline. For several minutes I simply sat there, watching the fury of the Dureco through the pavilion's open side. Trees bent at impossible angles, smaller branches snapped and became projectiles, and the rain fell in horizontal sheets driven by winds that must have exceeded 60 miles per hour. The concrete walls vibrated with the force of the storm, but held firm. I began to believe I might survive this ordeal after all. That's when I heard it, a heavy, rhythmic sound barely audible above the storm. A sound that didn't belong. Thumpity-thump, thumpity-thump. Something was approaching the shelter. For several excruciating minutes, we remained locked in this standoff, the bear advancing and retreating, me responding with increasingly desperate displays of aggression. My arms ached from holding the heavy pack aloft, and my throat had grown raw from shouting. During one particularly close approach, I caught a glimpse of the bear's eyes. There was intelligence there, a calculating awareness that chilled me more deeply than the rain that had soaked through my clothes. This was no mindless animal acting on instinct alone. It was weighing options, assessing risks, making decisions. Just as my strength began to wane, the bear made what appeared to be a final, committed charge. It crossed half the distance between us in a single bound, moving with shocking speed for something so large. I braced for impact, thrusting the pack forward with all my remaining strength. The bear collided with the pack, nearly knocking me off my feet. I felt the frame bend under the impact, heard the crunch of containers inside being crushed. The force drove me backward until my shoulders hit the concrete wall. For a terrible moment, I was pinned there, the bear's weight pressing against the pack, its hot breath penetrating the fabric. Then, remarkably, it withdrew. The sudden absence of pressure was so unexpected that I stumbled forward, barely catching myself before falling. The bear backed toward the open side of the shelter, making that strange circular motion again, a 360-degree turn that seemed born of confusion and agitation. It released another deep vocalization, part growl, part roar, before turning and lumbering away into the storm-ravaged forest. I remained frozen in position, backpack still held before me, waiting for the bear to circle back as it had before. Seconds stretched into minutes. 5 minutes. 10. The bear did not return. Eventually, I allowed myself to lower the pack, wincing at the pain in my shoulders and arms. The adrenaline that had sustained me began to ebb, leaving me shaking uncontrollably. My legs gave out, and I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the cold concrete floor, still clutching my makeshift shield. The storm continued unabated around me, but the immediate threat appeared to have passed. I sat there in stunned silence, rain blowing in through the open side of the shelter, soaking me further, though I hardly noticed. I had survived, for now. But night was falling, the storm showed no signs of abating, and I couldn't be certain the bear wouldn't return. Night in the forest during a derecho is a special kind of hell. As darkness enveloped the landscape, the visual cues that had provided some comfort, the ability to see approaching threats, to gauge the movement of trees in the wind, were stripped away, leaving only sound and touch to interpret the chaos. The decision to remain in the shelter was simultaneously obvious and terrifying. Venturing out into the storm-ravaged forest in darkness would be suicidal. Falling branches and uprooted trees posed a constant danger, one that would be impossible to navigate without sight. But staying meant accepting the possibility, perhaps probability, of the bear's return. I positioned myself in the corner farthest from the open side of the pavilion, my back against the junction of two concrete walls. My backpack, damaged but still useful, remained my primary defense. I kept it on my lap, ready to raise it at the first sign of the bear's return. My headlamp provided minimal comfort. I kept it on its lowest setting to preserve battery life, creating a small bubble of dim light that barely reached the edges of the shelter. Beyond that perimeter was absolute darkness, occasionally illuminated by flashes of lightning that transformed the forest into a strobing nightmare of twisted shapes and reaching shadows. The temperature dropped steadily as night progressed. My clothes were soaked through, and the concrete walls of the shelter seemed to radiate cold. I began to shiver uncontrollably, my teeth chattering with such force that I feared they might crack. Hypothermia became a secondary but very real concern. I needed to change into dry clothes, a seemingly simple task made nearly impossible by my circumstances. Changing meant temporarily abandoning my vigilance, becoming vulnerable during the process. But the alternative was allowing my core temperature to continue dropping, potentially reaching dangerous levels. After much internal debate, I decided to change in stages, removing and replacing one garment at a time, keeping my attention fixed on the open side of the shelter. I retrieved dry clothes from my backpack, thankful that I'd packed them in waterproof stuff sacks that had survived the bear's impact. The process was agonizingly slow. Each movement was hesitant, interrupted by frequent pauses to listen and watch. Every sound from the forest, and there were many, the storm creating a constant symphony of destruction, caused me to freeze, pulse racing, eyes straining against the darkness. By the time I'd changed completely, nearly an hour had passed. The dry clothes provided immediate relief, but the comfort was psychological more than physical. The ambient temperature continued to drop, and the concrete shelter offered no insulation. I considered my options for creating warmth. A fire was out of the question. Even if I could find dry material to burn, the open side of the shelter would allow wind and rain to extinguish any flame. My emergency space blanket had been in an outer pocket of my backpack and was now gone, likely torn away during the bear encounter. My sleeping bag remained, though slightly damp from the compression during the attack. I unrolled it and crawled inside, creating a cocoon that slowly began to capture my body heat. It was far from comfortable, but it was survival. Hours passed in a state of hypervigilance. Every snap of a branch, every gust of wind that changed pitch, every unfamiliar sound triggered a surge of adrenaline that made sleep impossible. The storm maintained its fury, seemingly feeding on its own energy, growing stronger rather than dissipating. Around what I estimated to be midnight, I heard it, the distinctive sound of heavy movement nearby. My entire body tensed, senses heightened to painful acuity. I extracted myself from the sleeping bag as quietly as possible, reaching for my backpack shield with trembling hands. The sound grew closer, more deliberate. Different from the random noise of the storm, this carried purpose. I rose to a crouching position, backpack held before me, headlamp switched off to prevent attracting attention. A massive shadow appeared at the edge of the shelter, unmistakably the bear, returning as I'd feared. It hesitated at the threshold, as if remembering our previous encounter. I could see its outline intermittently when lightning flashed, a hulking silhouette against the marginally lighter background of the night sky. I summoned what remained of my courage and repeated my earlier tactics, making myself appear larger, shouting hoarsely, thrusting the backpack forward threateningly. The display felt hollow, my movements sluggish from cold and exhaustion, my voice barely audible above the storm. Whether due to my efforts or its own caution, the bear did not enter the shelter. It remained at the edge, occasionally rising to its hind legs, occasionally circling partially around the structure. This standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear departed. I remained in position, unwilling to believe it had truly gone. Eventually, the immediate fear began to subside, replaced by a dull, throbbing dread that settled into my bones. I did not return to my sleeping bag. Instead, I sat with my back against the wall, backpack clutched to my chest, watching the open face of the shelter with burning eyes that refused to close despite my exhaustion. Throughout that endless night, the bear returned twice more. Brief appearances that seemed more investigative than aggressive. Each time I responded with diminishing energy but unwavering determination. Each time the bear withdrew without entering the shelter. Between these visits, I battled not only fear, but the insidious effects of sleep deprivation. My mind began to play tricks on me, peripheral vision conjuring movement where there was none, ears detecting sounds that existed only in my imagination. I pinched myself, bit my lip, pressed my fingernails into my palms, anything to maintain alertness. The night stretched on interminably, a seemingly endless cycle of terror, vigilance, and the growing certainty that I would not survive until morning. Dawn arrived, not with the dramatic flourish of a sunrise, but as a gradual lessening of darkness, a subtle shift from black to gray that I might have missed had I not been watching so intently for any change in my circumstances. The storm had weakened overnight, though the wind still gusted strongly enough to bend the tops of trees. The rain had diminished to a steady drizzle that seemed almost gentle compared to the previous day's deluge. I remained motionless, uncertain if this apparent reprieve was genuine or merely a cruel interlude in my ordeal. My body felt alien to me, muscles stiff and unresponsive from hours of tension, skin cold and clammy, mind foggy from exhaustion. The forest began to reveal itself in the growing light. Devastation surrounded me. Trees lay uprooted or snapped midway up their trunks. Branches and debris covered the ground in every direction. The familiar landscape I'd hiked through just days before had been transformed into something unrecognizable and hostile. I listened intently for any sound that might indicate the bear's presence. The storm's diminished intensity allowed for better auditory awareness, though the continuing wind still masked subtler noises. After several minutes of careful observation, I allowed myself to believe that the immediate threat had passed. Moving with painful slowness, I gathered my belongings. My backpack was severely damaged, frame bent, fabric torn in several places, contents crushed and jumbled. Still, it remained functional enough to carry what remained of my supplies. I took inventory of my situation. My food was largely intact, protected by its position deep in the main compartment. My water filter had survived, though one of my water bottles had been crushed. The map was soggy but readable. My phone, though protected in a waterproof case, showed no signal. Not that I had expected one this deep in the forest. The question now was what to do next. Continue my planned route? Attempt to return to the trailhead? Or remain at the shelter until conditions improved further? Logic dictated that movement was necessary. The derecho had likely caused widespread damage throughout the forest. Trails would be blocked, landmarks altered, navigation complicated. The sooner I began making my way back to civilization, the better my chances of reaching it before my supplies ran out. However, movement also meant vulnerability, exposure to potential hazards including weakened trees that could fall without warning, flooded streams, obscured trails, and of course, the bear, whose territory I was clearly within. After careful consideration, I decided to attempt to return to the trailhead. It would mean abandoning my original hiking plan, but survival now took precedence over recreation. I estimated I was approximately 17 miles from the ranger station, a distance that would normally take me less than 2 days to cover, but might now require 3 or more given the conditions. I packed methodically, prioritizing essentials and abandoning anything that wasn't absolutely necessary to lighten my load. My sleeping bag, though damp, was indispensable and took up most of the available space. Food, water, first aid supplies, and navigation tools claimed the rest. Before departing, I used my knife to carve a brief message into the concrete wall of the shelter. June 29th, 12. Derecho Bear, heading to Ranger Station, Michael. If something happened to me and search parties were sent out, they might find this clue to my intentions. Stepping out of the shelter was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Despite the danger it had presented, or perhaps because of it, the concrete pavilion had become a place of relative safety in my mind. Leaving it meant accepting a new level of vulnerability that made my stomach clench with anxiety. The forest floor was treacherous, covered in a layer of wet leaves and debris that concealed holes and unstable ground beneath. I moved cautiously, testing each step before committing my weight to it. My progress was painfully slow, but rushing would only increase the risk of injury. Navigation proved challenging. Familiar landmarks had been altered or destroyed entirely. The trail I had originally followed was now blocked in several places by fallen trees, forcing me to create detours through the underbrush. My compass and map remained reliable, but the straight-line distance they indicated was meaningless in the face of numerous obstacles. Throughout that first day of travel, I remained hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly scanning for signs of the bear. Each dark shape in the distance, each rustle in the underbrush, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. The memory of those amber eyes reflecting the dim light of the shelter haunted me, making me jump at shadows. Progress was discouragingly slow. By late afternoon, I estimated I'd covered only about 5 miles, less than a third of the distance to the ranger station. As daylight began to fade, I faced the grim reality of spending another night in the forest. Finding a suitable location to camp proved difficult. Most clearings were now occupied by fallen trees or standing water. Eventually, I settled on a slight rise where 3 large trees had fallen in such a way that they created a natural barrier on 2 sides. It wasn't ideal, but it offered more protection than most alternatives. I didn't bother setting up my tent. Instead, I created a makeshift shelter using my emergency tarp strung between 2 of the fallen trunks. It was crude, but would keep the worst of the rain off me during the night. As darkness fell, I sat beneath my tarp, back against a log, knife in one hand and headlamp in the other. Sleep seemed an impossible luxury, yet my body craved it desperately. I fought against my drooping eyelids, determined to maintain vigilance despite my exhaustion. Eventually, my physiological needs overcame my fear. I drifted into a fitful sleep punctuated by frequent startling awake at unfamiliar sounds. Each time my eyes snapped open, I expected to see the bear looming over me, but it never appeared. Dawn brought renewed determination. I packed quickly and continued my journey, moving with slightly more confidence as familiarity with the post-storm terrain increased. The weather had improved further, patches of blue sky occasionally visible through the canopy of remaining trees. By mid-morning of the 3rd day, I began to recognize landmarks that indicated I was approaching the outer boundaries of the wilderness area. My pace quickened with the promise of safety ahead. When I finally emerged from the forest onto the gravel road leading to the ranger station, the relief was overwhelming. My legs nearly gave out beneath me, weeks of tension releasing in a rush that left me lightheaded. The ranger, Bill, the same weathered man who had stamped my permit days earlier, was visibly shocked by my appearance. Apparently, several hikers had been reported missing after the derecho, and search parties were being organized. I was the first to return independently from the area where I'd been hiking. As I recounted my experience, a mixture of horror and respect crossed his features. "Derechos are no joke," he said simply when I finished. "And that bear encounter? You're lucky to be alive, son." Lucky indeed. Years have passed since that June in 2012, and I've continued hiking and camping. But never again alone. Never again without checking weather forecasts obsessively. And never again without respecting the raw power of nature and its inhabitants. The concrete shelter still stands in Monongahela National Forest. I've returned once, accompanied by experienced hikers, to see it again in daylight, under blue skies. My carved message remains on the wall. A reminder of 3 days that forever changed my understanding of wilderness, survival, and my own limitations. Sometimes in dreams, I still hear the thumpity thump of approaching danger, still feel the weight of my backpack shield in my trembling hands, still see those amber eyes reflecting in the darkness. I wake from these dreams gasping for breath, heart racing, but grateful to be waking at all. because not everyone who faced the derecho that summer was as fortunate as I was. And the bear, wherever it is now, remains the most terrifying teacher I've ever encountered.